This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with James O'Brien.
Good morning. Don't forget to put cream on today, or lotion. What do the kids call it? Anyway, be careful, otherwise you're going to come out as red as me, unintentionally. It feels a bit like today is... it's got an air of inevitability to it, almost, doesn't it? You remember when I came up with a phrase I was very, very pleased with many years ago now, when I noted that the queue for the ghost train will always be longer than the queue for the speak your weight machine, and nowhere is that truer than in the context of immigration. Reading and listening to some right-wing blowhards on the subject today, you realise that they cannot conceive of any government, whether it's blue, red or purple with yellow spots. They can't allow the conversation about immigration to go away, because if it ever did, so does their career. The Daily Mail would be reduced to about 6 pages. Some radio broadcasters would have to have 95% adverts if they weren't involved, and TV broadcasters as well, of course, increasingly, if they weren't able to rant deliriously about immigration on an almost daily basis. Some politicians would be completely out of a job. But it's an incredibly intoxicating brew that they serve up, isn't it? It's an incredibly powerful cocktail that speaks to so many different emotions, some of them quite base and unattractive, some of them less so. The narrative of invasion is essentially one that has kept us safe for 1,000 years, since the last successful one. And equally, the sense that something is being taken away from you by somebody who deserves it less can be true. It's an incredibly frustrating feeling. I talk a lot, or I have talked a lot to you, not so much recently actually, but it came back round last week in the context of Donald Trump, about the queue. I forget who came up with this. It wasn't me. I forget who came up with this the first time round, I think, explaining the success of Donald Trump, is that good people who have spent their life queuing up, a very British practice actually, but it holds across other populations because it's a metaphor, queuing, waiting for your return upon your investment, waiting for the other side of the social contract to be upheld. So people who have supported their families, people who have done jobs, worked hard, and in return, what do you expect? What do you expect? I used to do this thing when I was a kid, particularly when I started boarding, as I'd do a sort of audit at the end of every day and try and sort of cancel out the stuff I was worried about or the stuff that was bad with the stuff that was good. So I'd be like, oh God, I've not written my essay I've not done my Latin homework. Oh, but we've got a cricket match on Saturday and I'm in the team. It's a slightly odd thing to do. I haven't done it for years, but the idea that the contract is being fulfilled, I'm keeping my side of the contract, and the country is not keeping its, or the government is not keeping its. I don't know what we would write down anymore as the keeping of the social contract from the point of view of the government. The safety net of the welfare state, I think you don't properly appreciate until you need it. And by then it's too late to complain about it being a moth-bitten, flea-ridden, inadequate measure of protection, certainly compared to other countries. I used to think that the likelihood of becoming a homeowner was a fairly reliable measure, but that's been in retreat now for about a generation and a half. The access to certain things, health, I suppose, again, not something you value until you or a loved one needs it. And if you're in that queue, waiting for this hard-to-define payoff, this hard-to-define reward, deserved reward, earned reward, you're in a queue waiting for it, and somebody successfully persuades you that other people are pushing in front of you, and that the reason why you're not getting what you think you deserve is them. That's an incredibly powerful drug. And listen, I use the phrase somewhat leadingly. Someone has managed to persuade you that you're not getting what you deserve. I suppose it's possible that it's true on this occasion. You come to the notion that somebody in front, they're pushing in front, they're getting something I don't get. I want you to be completely honest with me. But when you get an impulse of frustration, how often is it informed by foreignness? So even if you find much of the rhetoric around immigration in the right-wing media pretty repellent, and you're worried about the direction that perhaps Keir Starmer has elected to go in this morning, although I think it's a little bit more nuanced than some of the analysis from his critics on his own side allows. How and this is a tough one for people to acknowledge, but if someone annoys you, let's just stick with the queue. Someone pushes in front of you in a supermarket, or somebody, I suppose if you find out somebody's got a job and you'd applied for it and you haven't got it, and if they turn out to have been born somewhere else, if they sound foreign, does it influence your impulse? Does it make you go, oh, that sort of exacerbates my frustration? That adds an element of insult to my injury. How can that job have gone to someone who has got less right to be here than me? That's a really interesting question, one that perhaps we don't ask often enough, because I don't think that makes you a racist. I think that makes you susceptible to racists. Somebody who could, perhaps with a little bit of effort and a magnifying glass, turn you into somebody who thinks that the foreignness of that person is somehow a bad thing rather than just an incidental characteristic. And in fact, even now in the States, you'll see people starting to claim the only reason they got that job was because they are, if not foreign, then from a minority. This fury about diversity, equity and inclusion programs essentially tries to posit the notion that you are being deliberately pushed out of your place in the queue, deliberately overtaken in the queue by people who deserve it less somehow. If I tell you who they are offering refugee status to in Washington at the moment, in the US today, I think, or yesterday evening they were due to fly in, what section of the world's society do you think that Donald Trump's administration is about to offer refugee status to in a country where immigration is an even hotter potato than it is here? You won't believe me when I tell you, and I'm going to keep that one in my pocket until a little bit later in the programme, because there it all is. There is the conversation. Keir Starmer has effectively, I think, and listen, everything's up for grabs this morning, so correct me if I'm wrong, 03456060973. Keir Starmer, I think, has decided to address the people in the queue for the ghost train. He has decided to address people whose concerns are informed by the origins of that person over there that's just annoyed them, or indeed the person that's pushed in front of them in the queue. I think traditional left-wing people would rather see blame for dissatisfaction laid at the feet of the people who've got more than they could ever need. But that ship seems to have sailed. What did we hear this morning? I'm in the curious position of essentially dedicating a radio programme to a speech that you may well not have heard. So why don't we listen to a bit of it, listen to a little bit of what Keir Starmer said earlier today.
Migration is part of Britain's national story. We talked last week about the great rebuilding of this country after the war. Migrants were part of that, and they make a massive contribution today, and you will never hear me denigrate that. But when people come to our country, they should also commit to integration, to learning our language. And our system should actively distinguish between those that do and those that don't.
Not that big a difference from something that he said on a stage about 5 years ago in 2020.
I think Conservatives have created this hostile environment, whether it's Windrush, whether it's the general response to immigration, or whether it's just the way the Home Office make their decisions. It's based on this idea that somebody's trying to cheat rather than actually based on an open, welcoming environment. I think we should welcome people wherever they come from, thank them for their contribution, and see them as part of our families, our communities, and our society, and embrace that. I mean, London is an amazingly diverse and fantastic place for it, and the whole of the United Kingdom is better because of immigration. And I think, if I'm honest, the Labour Party has been a bit scared of making the positive case for immigration for quite a number of years, and I think we need to turn that round and broaden it out and make sure that people feel absolutely welcome here.
Yeah, it is quite a sea change, isn't it? I don't know how you're going to dice that. make people feel absolutely welcome here by making the hoops that they have to jump through altogether harder and the length of time that they have to spend jumping through them twice as long. So how do we talk about this today? I mean, if you heard the speech, I'm interested in a little bit of post-match analysis. If you just want to tell me what you made of it, how it's affected you. I know that a lot of people who perhaps have made their home here after being born somewhere else are feeling quite bleak, are feeling quite let down. I don't know whether you're right to do so. I'd like you to point to the parts of the speech that make you feel that way. But for the rest of us, two things. Number one, something very weird is going to happen next week. You know about it if you were listening to this show on Friday. But you probably won't know about it if you are relying on the usual suspects for your coverage of the immigration conversation. You probably won't know about it if, for example, you rely upon the Daily Mail or their broadcasting equivalents. The Office for National Statistics will announce, I think it's next week or possibly the week after, that immigration into this country since Keir Starmer became Prime Minister has plummeted. And we're looking at figures that could be as much as half it would have come down by. These are numbers that are not quite definitive yet because you haven't got the numbers of people that have left the country. So the net migration figures haven't yet been factored into the measured and recorded reduction in the incoming figures, in the immigration. So we've got the immigration numbers, but we haven't got the emigration numbers. And when those numbers come out, and this is really weird, this is a little bit geeky of me, so I don't know that it's going to be part of the phone-in necessarily. But in political terms, the figures are going to deliver exactly what Keir Starmer is promising today. I don't know whether this is the plan, because it's pretty blooming transparent if it is the plan. But you had an unprecedented peak of 900,000 people net immigration into this country in 2023. And that figure, net migration in 2025, is probably now running at around half of the figure that Labour inherited in 2024. So that was already down to 730,000. So the figure shows 460,000 fewer visas have already been issued in 2024 than 2023. The figure is going to be less than half of what it was at the peak of 2023. And that is going to be announced next week. And I don't know if it matters. And that's what I want you to tell me. Here's part of the reason why it doesn't matter. Here is a conversation about legal migration, controlled migration, visas that are issued. Rupert's been in touch to say, do these immigration figures you speak of include the illegal immigration numbers? No, Rupert. And that's why I don't think they matter. Because people like you are always going to push your way to the front of the queue for the ghost train. So here is all of the available evidence, but here is a man determined to still be angry, regardless of what is done. I think Keir Starmer could bring it down to 100,000. But if one boat crosses the channel, then the appeal of certain politicians remains undimmed. And of course, the people crossing the channel are not illegal immigrants in the sense that the words used to mean, because the massive majority of them have their asylum applications processed. And the only reason they're crossing the channel in boats is because we successfully stopped the trafficking of people in the back of lorries, and we shut down all the legal routes. So that bit of the, and maybe Rupert doesn't speak for a significant swathe of the immigration-obsessed population. Maybe you think people will learn of the massive reduction in numbers. And of course, if it's your job that you're worried about, then it's not illegal immigration that you're worried about. If it's your access to your rewards or the welfare state that you're worried about, then it's not illegal immigration that you're worried about. It is legal immigration. Legal immigration is what affects all of the things that are measurable in this country. And it has been incredibly high for years. And next week, it will be announced that it is the lowest it has been for a very, very long time. And I want to know whether you think it will make any difference at all. So there are three ways into the programme this morning. 0345 60 60 973 is the number you need. Question number one. Keir Starmer in 2020 promised not to make you feel unwelcome, not to make people feel unwelcome. Hand on heart, do you feel unwelcome today? More so than yesterday, with this speech from a Labour Prime Minister. Question number two, and this is the one I really want you to dig into, because I don't know. I'd like to be wrong. But having covered this issue for the best part of 20 years, I don't think that rational conversations about immigration have ever really taken place in this country. For every worthy analyst and academic, you can find 10 saloon bar bores, some of whom, of course, now are in the House of Commons, have been for a long time, to come on and put out the lazy Facebook tropes, or to do the classic othering and division, speaking to a form of social hierarchy, that one type of human being is somehow worth more than another. But when you learn that the numbers, the big numbers, are plummeting, in a logical universe, you take the sting out of the whole immigration debate. Whether the sting should be there or not is moot now, because everybody's speaking to the people queuing for the ghost train. I just don't know. And I really want you to have a think about that and tell me what you reckon. And be honest with me. For you, if this number comes down to, let's say, 400,000 or 300,000, and could continue to come down in the coming years, largely because of policies the last lot brought in, and because we don't have Hong Kong and Ukraine skewing the figures anymore. But that's part of the reason why it doesn't matter. If the numbers plummet, yeah, all right. The reason I interrupted myself there is because a question popped into my mind. Does immigration conversation have anything to do with immigration numbers? It's a weird question, right? But I reckon you might agree with me that it doesn't. Not in this country, not in post-Brexit Britain. It's got nothing to do with numbers. 0345 6060 973 is the number you need. Do the numbers matter at all? And of course, if they don't, then Keir Starmer's on a hiding to nothing. What is the morning when you wake up and go, actually, do you know what? I'm not angry about that anymore, or I'm not worried about that anymore? I don't know that day will ever dawn. It's 20 past 10.
James O'Brien on LBC.
22 minutes after 10 is the change. To quote yourself, James, writes Steve, when the facts change, you have to change your mind. Starmer has somehow got to find a way to confront the concerns of a section of the electorate who have been seduced by far-right BS. I don't agree with that, for what it's worth, Steve. I think something subtler is going on here, and I'm not quite sure what it is. But what I do know is that the numbers may not be the beginning or even the end of the story. And that's where we'll start, I think. That, and of course, and the question of how this lands personally rather than politically. Jay is in Manchester. Jay, what would you like to say?
Hi, thank you, James. Thank you for having me on. I always love the show.
Thank you.
I'm a doctor, qualified, came to the UK to write all the exams to be a doctor in the UK. I passed that exams, but for almost a year, I've not been able to get a job. So I came to the UK, through the carer route, got a job as a carer, while, with the hope that after I've been in the UK for such a long time, hopefully I can get a job,
Why do you think you can't get a job as a doctor?
Because, I think it's oversubscribed. The GMC, we write exams every 3-4 months. So there's a lot of people coming into the system, and there's just not a lot of jobs available.
Okay. Most people will be surprised to learn that. They'll probably think of there being a shortage of doctors as opposed to
exactly.
To
I've submitted over 500 applications, but you just can't seem to get a job. So I got a job as a carer.
Okay.
Now, getting that as a carer, you get told you can't bring your family. I have a wife and a child. You can't bring them. You have to do the job, without them. And at the end of all of that process, you felt, okay, there's an end in sight. It was a 5-year process, and hopefully you can get to the end of the process, and then you can bring your wife and your children. And then you wake up this morning, you get told, number one, that goalpost has been moved forward to 10 years. You can't bring your wife and your children for 10 years. You have to keep laboring in the system. Do not forget that the fee for the ILR in the first place is about £3,000. We get paid roughly about 1.5 to 1.6 a month. So for me to even apply for the ILR previously was going to be 2 months, wages for me to even, be able to apply for that by myself. All of a sudden, I have to pay more into the system. And I understand the issue of the fairness to the British people.
Well, listen, we haven't got the full detail of it yet, but you may be worrying unduly that the most prized people, and it's an unfortunate phrase, but it's the only one that fit will have much quicker routes to permanent residence. So the most highly skilled and the most high earning. So you find yourself in the bizarre position as if you get a job as a doctor, suddenly your fortunes change. Whereas if you carry on working as a carer, they don't.
Exactly, but I think it all boils down to the system of, does this feel, and I understand that it has to feel fair to the British populace, but it's talking about the people at the other end of the line. We do the job, we do the carer roles and all of that. There's no, career progression for any of us, but it's that, you have to do this, you can't bring your family. And as you rightly said earlier, James, is that the numbers seems to be falling, so why not wait for, next week?
It's not seem to be falling, they are categorically falling. The only question next week is by how many hundreds of thousands will they have fallen, and that is why your call is so poignant in a way, because anybody listening to you and thinking, well, and I'm putting words into other people's mouths here, but I think we both know they exist, thinking this chap on the radio, why should he be able to bring his wife and children here? I mean, whether he's working as a doctor or a carer, well, that just means less for us. That means less of the pie for my children and my grandchildren, and that rhetoric exists. And it doesn't go away. It's a bleak conclusion, this. And Jay and I would love to be proved wrong, or at least to hear compelling arguments about why we are wrong. But I don't think the numbers matter. Again, something that's missing from a lot of the coverage. Expect ministers to talk a lot more later this week about illegal immigration, which gets the fires burning even more rampantly than legal migration. But that's not what today's speech, today's white paper, or today's conversation on this programme is about. So the number of lower skilled and care workers coming to the UK pretty much straight away under this white paper, they reckon will be down by 50,000. What the heck is the care sector going to do? We may get onto that in the second hour. We may need to speak to Jay again. Michael is in Coventry. Michael, what made you pick up the phone?
Basically, James, I've listened to it all the while, and it's down to one man. I mean, they're all frightened of Mr. Farage and his populism and all that lot. But just listening to your individual there, the way he's on about, and I'll take my hat off to him. I mean, back in the 60s and that, my mother come over from Ireland during the war, build up aircraft and everything else, and my father and that, and then when my grandfather passed away and that, I mean, she was able to bring my nan over. I mean, my nan lived with us for years until she passed away. So what's happened to them values we had them days to now?
I don't know, actually. I know some of the research shows 50% of the population are pretty relaxed about where things are and how things are going. But I've got so many statistics swilling around in my brain sometimes. I need a moment to dig them out and find them. Sundar Katwala is a brilliant... he's got a great piece in the Financial Times today, and he tweets and blue skies a lot in this field. He's from British Future, and the author of How to Be a Patriot. But those values, we talk a lot about British values, don't we? I don't know where they've gone, the values you describe. I don't know. I mean, obviously Farage is the focal point for a lot of this feeling, and probably the patron saint of not really caring about the numbers. If one boat turns up in Dover in an entire year, he'll be there with his Fisher-Price binoculars, rubbing his thighs, and with a camera crew in tow these days. But it's not. I mean, the Daily Mail's been doing this for 50 years. The Daily Mail was doing this about Jews when they were fleeing Nazi Germany. The right-wing media always attacks people who have the least in order to justify a status quo which delivers the most to the people that own the newspapers. But even that today feels like a bit of a lazy trope, a bit of an easy out. If the numbers plummet, does anything change in terms of the conversation?
I don't think it would, James, because we're stuck in that situation where people just can't see people for what they are. They're individuals, they're human beings. Most of us are never going to be in the places where these guys have been and what happened to them. We haven't. I mean, where would we have been in 1939, 40 if people didn't answer the call? We celebrated 80 years the other day. Where would we be?
And we learnt an awful lot. We learnt an awful lot about the role played by Indian soldiers and Caribbean soldiers, and we're still learning it now, 80 years after the event. And here's a worry, and it ties in with a couple of the messages in my inbox today. If the numbers don't matter, what happens next? So the numbers plummet, and people are still cross. the numbers come down at a rate of knots, and the people who can't point to the negative impact that immigration has had on their lives are not going to abandon the conviction that immigration has had a negative impact on their life. So where does it go next? Let's say Starmer gets it down to 200,000. What's next? I won't be happy until we have remigration, these people will say. We need to start sending people back. Back where? We need to start getting, and of course, that is another tune that Donald Trump is already merrily playing on the other side of the Atlantic. 10:30 is the time. I know this question is a bit vaguer than usual, but if you think about it, it's not vague. It needs proper digging down. Do the numbers matter at all? And I suppose what I really want to know is whether they actually matter to you, whether you're sitting there today thinking one of two things or one of three things. You're thinking, A, yes, they do matter actually, James, and there is a figure which would be perfectly reasonable for me, and it's not one that I can expect a target to be attached to, because you never know when a Ukraine might happen, or we might suddenly need, there might be a pandemic and we need all the health staff we can get, but I know that 900,000 is far too high and 300,000 is fine. Or you're sitting there thinking, oh my God, he's talking about me. My feelings on this are not remotely affected by the numbers because I had no idea they were about to halve. And my feelings today, well, we don't know until next week whether they're going to change at all, but I am a victim of rhetoric. I'm a victim of politics. I am possibly the person that Keir Starmer is trying to talk to, but I don't know that numbers do matter to me. Or, of course, option 3, perhaps the least likely to phone me, I am a massive racist, and that's why I don't care about numbers, and I think that we should be deporting people who've done absolutely nothing wrong for the crime of being foreign-born. And I don't know where you draw the divisions between those three. You have a look at some of the social media activity of recently elected Reform UK councillors, and they're all over Category 3. But, of course, they also claim to be representing the feelings or the legitimate concerns of people in Category 2 or even Category 1. Dominic Ellis has your headlines.
James O'Brien on LBC.
10:35 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. The recent Australian election was very interesting. Anthony Albanese's Labour government in 2023 did something that I think Keir Starmer has bottled today, although he may claim that's the path that he's on, a balancing of control and contribution. But crucially, it involves defending humanitarian routes and promoting citizenship. As things stand in this country, there aren't really any humanitarian routes, unless, of course, you're Ukrainian. And therefore, the balance seems to be completely absent, which is part of the reasoning behind my question this hour, which is, do you think the numbers actually matter at all? They, of course, won the recent election. The opposition during that election was doing what I think they look as if they're a little bit ahead of us. Isn't that weird? I think about Ireland a lot for a whole heap of reasons. But I think about the way that in the course of my lifetime, Ireland and the UK have swapped places when it comes to reactionary politics and when it comes to social cohesion and progressiveness. The last election in Ireland, lots of people on Twitter claimed was going to be fought on the issues of immigration, and it just wasn't. Despite the best efforts of people who pay Elon Musk for the privilege of having their messages over-promoted, it just didn't land. People used to talk about Australia as an example of a country that had got the right approach to immigration, but the party promising to reduce net migration by another 100,000, they just lost the general election. It's weird. I used to have a theory that it's only the countries where Rupert Murdoch holds sway that get absolutely broken by the immigration conversation, but I don't know if that theory was ever correct. It doesn't apply anymore. But there it is. And John points out that even if the figures, I don't know if he's being sensible or silly on this, but as he says, you can't trust government figures. I don't know whether he's saying what the people will say, even when the numbers come down. Sort of Faragists will say, well, you can't trust those figures. I know they're not true because I saw at least 4 brown people this morning on my way to work. Or whether he is genuinely one of the people who will say that. So then the numbers never matter because you'll believe what you want to believe regardless of the statistics. And that, of course, is another path that Donald Trump has already led the United States down, and one upon which we seem in danger of following him. Jay is in Derby. Jay, what made you pick up the phone?
Hi, James. Nice to speak to you today.
Likewise.
I kind of woke up And I just was asking
Well,
myself,
that's a good start, Jay. Thank you.
I'm still asleep. So I'm just kind of asking myself, what happened to evidence-based policy, and I'm feeling that what happened to dignity for immigrants or humans, like what really happened to that? And about 40 minutes ago, I've had several friends speak to me, several friends who are immigrants. One of them, all of them on settled status, but one of them in particular phoning me actually in waves of tears, and me not quite knowing what to say to them.
Because they've had, they've been specifically penalised this morning. They've seen their wait go from 5 years to 10 years, or just through a sort of general sense of persecution. I
think a bit of both, because I think they think they'll be fine, but it's more of this area of the unknown now. I mean, they wanted Labour to win back in July 24, because they think they was the better choice compared to Reform and Tories, the other parties who are up there right now, and they think if this is Labour, what on earth if this is kind of their best case scenario potentially come the next election. God forbid what will happen if Reform or the Tories win to settle status.
Let me play you the bit from today's speech again, and just because the problem we've all got, even me, when I try so hard to sort of paddle my little canoe in the opposite direction, is that almost all of the coverage we get is coming through a lens of right-wing media. BBC may be an exception, but it's in the 17th paragraph of their political editor's article under the headline, Why Labour Aims to Buck 25-Year Trend of Rising Legal Migration. It's paragraph 17 you get to before he acknowledges that it's already plummeting, and that will be announced next week. So just listen to this for me.
Migration is part of Britain's national story. We talked last week about the great rebuilding of this country after the war. Migrants were part of that, and they make a massive contribution today, and you will never hear me denigrate that. But when people come to our country, they should also commit to integration, to learning our language, and our system should actively distinguish between those that do and those that don't.
Your friends are hearing denigration, even as he insists there isn't any.
Exactly. They've come here. They've learnt the language before coming here, and even I'm not sure that's even relevant how much they speak the language or not. I mean, it reminds me of a conversation you had with Mr. Farage about 10 years ago.
Yeah.
And
for people who don't remember that, he was complaining about people speaking foreign on trains without acknowledging that his children speak foreign at home to their German mum. I think he actually said the words, I don't suppose they do it on a train, but that feels like a distant age when the evidence-based analysis that you value still mattered a bit.
He did, and I think the problem here really with the stance that Labour's taken is that most of the people who, in my experience, are loudest in immigration are people who perhaps don't actually experience it very much. So these likely changes, they don't experience it anyway. These changes, they're going to continue not experience it. But what they are going to continue to experience is the NHS in a crisis, is the cost of living crisis going on.
And God forbid they need to put a parent in a care home.
Yeah, exactly.
We may move into that area specifically next. So I mean, at the very least, it's an exercise in trying to have your cake and eat it, because he could say to your friends, I don't mean you. That echo of the post-Brexit bigotry that we explored in some detail on this programme. I don't mean you, but he doesn't have the power to stop people feeling that it does mean you. It does mean them.
It's exactly right, and I don't know if you've gone through the white paper, which has now been released in the past half an hour, I believe, and the actual point system, like the point, there's like a chart that's been released, and one of my friends messaged me while I was on the phone to you, now I'm just looking, and they would have 20 points despite having a degree and a master's degree here from the University of Nottingham, and they are now continuing to work at University of Nottingham, but under this new system, they do not count as a skilled worker in their current job.
Gosh. And what does that achieve? Who now thinks, Starmer's my man. He's persecuting the right people. He's clamping down on him and her and him and her. I just don't think it touches the sides of some of the more emotive contributors to this conversation. And listen, the small boats are an incredibly emotive phenomenon, and they're not the focus of today's speech or indeed today's white paper, and they will be addressed later in the week, but it seems like an impossible challenge. And until it is met, then none of this stuff will achieve what Starmer hopes it will achieve, and all it will do is make the experiences and the existence of the people that Jay describes worse. It's a weird one, isn't it? And possibly possibly legitimate concerns notwithstanding, although it is always rather harder to find them than it is to actually say those words out loud, is that you're sort of shoveling food into an insatiable appetite. It is this, once you cross that Rubicon of trying to sate the feelings of people who don't like foreigners or feel threatened by immigration, and then you've got all the different gradations and the threshold at which, no, that's a perfectly reasonable opinion to hold. But once you start trying to feed that beast, you're doomed. Because if you're in power, you can't. You can only really feed it in opposition. It is 10:43. Thank you, Jay. Patrick's in Luton. Patrick, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. I'm not in Luton at all, buddy, but I appreciate you taking my call. James, I was only giving you a call because you asked a couple of questions, and one of them was, does the numbers matter? And
you told the producer you were in Luton.
I told the producer I lived in Luton once upon a time. Oh, okay. I also said I lived in Bedford and Milton Keynes. But
so where are you calling from, mate?
I live in St Neots, bud, in Cambridgeshire. So I've listened to you for a long time, James. A lot of what you say is perfectly sensible and coming from a point of view of care more than anything. My struggle is that Keir Starmer said something that you completely overlooked until maybe the last couple of minutes, which is that a lot of people do feel like they live in a place where they don't recognise anything. They don't recognise it as a place that they can call home. And
I played that clip at the top of the hour, and I played it again 3 minutes ago, bud.
Okay, I know you don't like being called by the tone of your voice, but
so
anyway.
What's your point?
My point is this, mate. So basically, large parts of the country and large parts of towns and cities up and down this country have a large influx of people from an area of the world where they don't necessarily understand culture of the UK. I don't know if you could name what the culture of the UK is, but
why don't you?
Can't. Because I'm making a point, buddy. Which
I know, buddy. But what is the culture of the UK that you don't feel people are properly absorbing?
James, I'll be honest. What you're doing is you're asking me a question without listening to the question you already asked.
No, you've just said that they're not properly observing the culture of the UK, and you said you may not know what it is. So I asked you to clarify for me.
I said they may not understand it.
Yeah. So what is it?
What question you want answering? The questions that you posed at the beginning of the hour?
No, the question that you've prompted by the quality of your contribution has posed the question of what this culture of the UK is that you're talking about. We can't go on with the conversation until we've nailed down what it is.
How's that, though, James? If you're asking a question
why can't you tell me what it is? You're criticising people who don't know what the culture of the UK is, so you must be able to tell me.
This is mad. When have I criticised that? I was literally making a round point, of which that was one of them. But
so what is the culture of the UK?
The culture of the UK is probably a lot of different things, James, that if you let me carry on the answer to the question you actually posed, opposed to the question that you want to pose.
So you can't tell me. You crack on, answer whatever question you want.
I can't be asked, buddy. Have a good day.
That went well, didn't it, buddy? Culture of the UK. They don't absorb the culture of the... What is it? Absolutely no idea. But I'm absolutely furious with the people that can't answer that question. Oh, whoops. I'm one of them.
James O'Brien on LBC.
10:49 is the time, and there it is in many ways. The source of the unhappiness that many people who voted for Keir Starmer feel today is built upon the notion that he is addressing precisely the kind of people who talk about British culture or British values, like Patrick a moment ago in St Neots, without being able to tell you what it is. So what do people like that mean when they say that? Well, you could point at foreign shops. You could point at foreign dress, I suppose. You could point at people's obviously observable ethnicity, people speaking a language to each other that they don't speak to you. And Keir Starmer is directly addressing that fear, that phenomenon, and he hasn't explained what it is yet either. And we're back to the Farage on the train 12 years ago, talking about people speaking foreign without mentioning that his own children speak foreign at home. We're back to the claims about primary schools being full of children who can't speak English, when actually it was children who have English as a second language, which means it's not their mother tongue any more than Nigel Farage's daughters have English as a mother tongue. They have German as a mother tongue because their mother is German. So we should be celebrating having a multilingual society, a multilingual population, but we're not, because it offends upholders of British culture. It offends defenders of British culture. And I'm afraid that asking people who are concerned about the welfare of British culture, what they mean by British culture, is a question that I never get tired of asking, because the answer is almost always what you just heard. I'm not only unable to tell you, or at least I could tell you, but I would unmask myself as a massive racist if I did, but I'm going to get really, really cross with you for asking, and I'm going to try and turn it into a conversation about your audacity for asking me to determine or to define what British culture is, even as I dedicate my entire position to a claim that it is somehow under threat. So you don't like people talking foreign, or you don't like people who look foreign, or you don't like people that dress foreign. That's fine, but say so. Say so. 10:52 is the time. Nick's in Wadhurst. Nick, what would you like to say?
Hi, yes. Thank you, James. Yeah, there's a lot of truth to what you're saying about a failure to own these opinions. They're always in this sort of veil of respectability. But coming back to your main question today, I think the answer is an emphatic no.
The numbers do not matter.
They do not, and I think people, Reform voters or Daily Mail readers listening to your show this morning, driving their cars into work and hearing you state emphatically and unequivocally that immigration is plummeting, what percentage of those people do you think that put a spring in their step? And they thought, great, that's good news.
Such a good question. I should have framed it like that, actually. What are you doing tomorrow when we have our pre-show meeting?
I think the answer, though, is zero. And as for how I come to that conclusion, well, what is the commercial model of the mid-market tabloid press, the Daily Mail and Daily Express? What is its messaging? It is you, a decent, salt-of-the-earth human being, dear reader, are being screwed over by a crazy leftist world.
That's the narrative. Here's Rob in Wiltshire. He says, you're so out of touch. Even Starmer knows what is going on. We are drowning in an ocean of economic migrants. So even if you give the numbers to Robert in Wiltshire, he's still in his mind, poor lad's still drowning.
Exactly. And the figures you mentioned this morning, they undermine his sense that he's being screwed over by the world, which is a huge part of his identity, morale, and sense of ideological fruitfulness and well-being, if you like.
It's identity politics. It's who they are. It's who you. But that's not helpful in identifying the people who are. What's the word that we want? Rescuable? I mean, that sounds condescending, but the people who are...
Yeah.
I mean, that phrase legitimate concerns keeps coming around and smacking us around the back of the head. And working on the presumption that there are some, why doesn't he or she respond to the news of the numbers in a more positive and upbeat fashion?
Well, no, you're absolutely right. And, I mean, just like the newspapers do their market research, the major parties do their political research. And, I mean, apart from the fact that this is beguilingly complicated, I'm going to say problem to fix, even though those words need a hell of a lot of unpacking. But let's, for argument's sake, say it is a problem to fix. The reality is, if they fired a magic bullet at it and fixed it tomorrow, the positive response would be acute, it would be extreme, but it would be short-lived. There's much more long-term political capital in taking a hard line with the problem, inverted quotes.
Could this work for Starmer? I mean, before the last fellow hung up, unfortunately, I was going to ask him if it made him more likely to actually vote Labour. I, from where I'm sitting, it seems unlikely, but if that is the vote he's going after, is he on a hiding to nothing?
Possibly. What I think he's aiming for... James, I know how you love an analogy.
Go on then.
To me, a hardline take from a political party on immigration is your complex carbohydrate. Farage is a simple carbohydrate, a hit of sugar. And what I mean by that is there's long-term capital in taking a hard line on the problem rather than taking drastic measures to fix it. And that's what Starmer's trying to do, and obviously cannibalise, or rather just eat some of Reform's support. No, I don't think it will ultimately be successful. I think the response will be too little too late, and people are too enamoured with the much harder line that Reform are always going to offer.
And if Patrick could have been, quotes, asked, end quotes, to explore his own position, what would he have said British culture was, do you think?
I think...
You don't have to answer that, because I don't know. I can only speculate.
Well, I guess it's the sort of Brexit vision of PG Woodhouse and cricket on the lawn. I don't know.
And Gussie Fink-Nottle, who was Prime Minister for a while, of course, and that didn't work out very well. 10:56 is the time. Chris is in Lewisham. Chris, what made you pick up the phone?
Hi, James. How you doing?
Good, mate.
Right, so I was listening a little while ago to one of your shows, and it was about driving. I drive around different boroughs of London every week, and to bring back to Patrick's point, in my opinion, the biggest thing that causes problems for me is just purely manners. The driving rules, what we are taught, how we are taught to drive, how we let one go when we're at a junction to keep traffic moving, how we put our hand up to say thanks, or just be polite. I find it day in, day out that generally you don't get that in return. And really, manners is what I've been brought up to stand by.
But this isn't about this. Correct me if is this about immigration for you?
It is because purely for the fact that the people that you don't get a response for that you're
how do you know they're immigrants?
Expecting. Well, I would say that it's because they're, i.e., not. I mean, when you're on the road, you can tell who's driving.
How do you know they're immigrants? The people that aren't saying thank you.
Potentially, they're not immigrants, but potentially they could be. I don't know. I wouldn't know. All I'm saying is purely from my point of view.
Well, that's why I just wanted to clarify that complaining about etiquette on the road isn't really a conversation about immigration, and you said it was. No,
well, when you was talking to Patrick, you was asking about culture and what British culture stands for, and to me, it is manners and being courteous.
Yeah, I agree. But I've got. Yeah. I mean, I know loads of people who were either not born here or whose parents weren't born here who would also agree with that.
Yeah.
So why did you think this was a contribution to a conversation about immigration? I don't want to embarrass you, but it's a bit.
No, that's fine. It's not embarrassing. But because you think that I am in different boroughs every day, and really there is a lot of language barrier.
Not when you're driving.
All right. Well, then the rules of driving are slightly different for everybody.
I mean, listen, I will bow to you as someone who spends more time on the roads than I do, but it used to be BMW drivers who had no manners, didn't it? Should we deport them?
No,
all right.
This is not. I just wanted to make my point, and
you've
really
made it.
all I wanted to do.
And that's fine, and thank you. But I mean, it's an interesting point, isn't it? And of course, if the figures plummet next week, and people are still rude to you on the roads, or people still don't say thank you, then I don't know that it will have changed your view on the issue that you've just raised. I notice it, oddly, as someone who doesn't drive a lot, but I do notice when we go to Kidderminster. My mum lives in rural Worcestershire, and the people who pull over to let you pass and all the saying please and thank you is measurable. But I've always just thought that was because driving around in big cities is so much more stressful than driving around in rural Worcestershire. Maybe people should have to display their nationality like we used to have Kevin and Tracy across the top of the car windscreen, and then you'll know whether it is actually an immigration issue that you're observing.
James O'Brien on LBC.
Anyway, it's not the small boats we should be worrying about, it's the small cars. 3 minutes after 11 is the time. So the question remains about numbers. And listen, Patrick and Christopher both making points that perhaps they found a little harder to make on air than they would have done off air. But the idea that immigration is why people are rude on the roads, or that immigration is undermining British culture when you can't quite say what it is, or you refuse to explain what you mean when you use those words. I hesitate to put words in people's mouths because, of course, it's a phone-in show, and I shouldn't have to. But you have to wonder what those sort of impulses and attitudes, what happens to them when the numbers come down. What will a huge decrease in the number of people coming to this country from overseas achieve when it is announced next week? Answer, I think, pessimistically, next to nothing. Someone's just messaged me saying that Winston Churchill was a notoriously rude driver, but I think I've got no way of knowing whether that's true or not. It's a great line, but I'm only reading it out because it's a great line. I'm not reading it out as a historical fact. So I knew this would happen. It's the big question that I like. And then all the other little questions that I haven't asked start scurrying around beneath it. So do the numbers actually matter? 900,000 in 2023. That figure is likely to be around 340, 350, give or take, this year. And that is the year, effectively, since Keir Starmer became Prime Minister. The Tories will claim, with some justification, that the clampdown on visas for people in sectors where we need staff is largely down to them. The increase in immigration, of course, that was brought about by Brexit gets very much glossed over because the people who love denigrating immigration most passionately were also the people that sold you Brexit. So the most obvious way of explaining it is that people who would come here from countries nearby were, A, more likely to not be coming here permanently or coming here for shorter terms, and B, younger and more mobile and therefore less likely to bring their family. So listen, to acknowledge everybody who has a problem with that, you caused it. You know, an awful lot of people, perhaps on the other side of the argument, think it's perfectly reasonable for you to bring your family if you're going to be schlepping halfway around the world to do a job that somebody in the country you're going to doesn't want to do. Seems to me a fairly decent and humanitarian trade-off. But if we are to acknowledge the, quotes, legitimate concerns, end quotes, of people who don't want their care workers bringing their wives over to this country, or their husbands, or God forbid, their children, then you have to also acknowledge that Brexit is what created the system where that has become much more likely to happen. Because, you know, the young Polish workers, or the young Eastern European workers, or the young Germans who were working, or the young French in hospitality, they are now being replaced by people from much further away, coming for much longer periods of time, and therefore much more likely to want to bring their families. And that is now being reversed. I don't know what it's going to do to hospitality. I don't know what it's going to do to the care sector. But the biggest thing I don't know is whether the numbers will matter at all. And that's the question I'd like you to answer. 0345 60 973 is the number you will need as soon as there's a free phone line into the building. And remember, the subtext, as ever on a morning like this, is what you hear when the Prime Minister essentially, a Labour Prime Minister, essentially says, oh, I don't mean you. And he's telling the truth. He doesn't mean you. But that isn't necessarily how it feels to be you. Nathan is in Wolverhampton. Nathan, what would you like to say?
Hi, James.
Hello.
Yeah, so I just want to answer your question of whether the numbers do matter. And I want to say, yes, the numbers do matter. Now, for context, I have to say that I guess I would fall in the camp that you've described of people who subscribe to quote-unquote right-wing media.
Sure.
I share the same sentiments and views as the ones that you're demonizing, for lack of a better word. But yeah, I don't want to jump all over you. No, I don't want to jump all over you. But just give me a little bit more flesh on those bones, if you would. What sort of sentiments and views? Well, I mean, the conversation for today is about immigration, and you describe the people who, I guess, view immigration as a big issue and something to be sorted, and I guess, in your words, sort of blow it out of proportion. But I sort of agree with a lot of that rhetoric. And to come back to your question, of course, the numbers do matter. Now, I wasn't a fan of the Labour government. I wasn't happy that they got in power. But when I heard the news about the numbers that you've spoken about, yes, that did put a pep in my step. I was like, oh, okay, this could actually be a good thing. So ultimately, for me, it's about the impact that's happening as a result of that government. So if they get this right, if it improves the country, I think that's a good thing. And
what would we be looking for in the context of improvement?
So in terms of to answer that question, let me just emphasize on the numbers. It's great that the numbers are coming down, but at the end of the day, it's about the lived experience of the people in the country.
Yes.
So the reason that people pick up on immigration is because immigration puts pressures on services on the country. So healthcare, education, community services and stuff like that. So the more people there are, the more those services are under pressure, and people feel that, jobs are harder to get. When you go to the A&E, you wait for 5 hours. I was there a couple of weeks ago because my wife was unfortunately very, very unwell. We got there, and they told us we had to wait for about 6 hours. It's those kind of.
And in those circumstances, you immediately think of immigration.
No, I don't immediately think of immigration, but it's a factor that I can't ignore because
14 years of austerity. In the year 2010, patient satisfaction with the NHS was the highest it had ever been.
Look,
that was after 13 years of high immigration under Labour. So why do you think of immigration when you're presented with a long wait at a hospital?
No. So that's fair enough, and this is my point.
To add another point, if I may, the net contribution to the public purse of a working age immigrant is higher than a working age native. So in terms of what goes in and what gets taken out, they're a net benefit to public services, and yet in your mind they're a drain. Why do you think that is? Because respectfully, you're wrong. So why do you think you've ended up being wrong about this?
No. Well, fair enough. Respectively, I think you're wrong, but it doesn't matter. We'll just have a conversation.
This isn't an opinion. This is counting. You go to a hospital and there's a long waiting list. You immediately think it's because of immigration. I just wonder why.
No. I didn't say that. And this is the thing, James.
You did, mate.
I think
you told me about your wife, who I hope is well and was as well treated, and you talked about the lived experience of people and believing that immigration was the reason why you had such a long wait at the hospital. I mean, you can tell me that you made a mistake when you said that, but you can't pretend you didn't say it.
Let me explain. It was a mistake. From what you're saying, I'm hearing that you misunderstood me. So let me clarify.
Of course.
Okay. What I'm saying is, the fact of the matter is, if there is 1 million more people in the country, those 1 million more people need to use the same services that were there before they arrived in the country. So if I have a hospital in Wolverhampton, this is where I live, there's that hospital. If 500,000 more people come to Wolverhampton, it's the same hospital, James.
And are they? But then we look at the age. We look at the age demographics. We look at the staffing of the hospital. We look at who is most likely to need care in the health sector and who is most likely to provide it demographically. And you come away with a fairly powerful argument for immigration, not against it. And you can't really gloss over the fact that patient satisfaction under the last Labour government up to 2010 was the highest it has ever been. So why? If there were hundreds of thousands of people coming into the country during that period, was patient satisfaction the highest it's ever been? Millions of people.
Because, and this goes back to your central question that you asked at the beginning. So let me answer your question. If you just let me answer the question.
Well, I wish you'd answer one of them.
It's great the numbers are coming down, but it's not about the numbers, James. It's about the lived experience of people in this country.
So the lived experience of people in this country in 2010 was that after incredibly high, historically unprecedented levels of immigration, the experience of the NHS was the highest it had ever been. So your point just doesn't work.
No. Let me make it first, James, and then you can tell me whether it doesn't work. My point is, even if immigration numbers were going up right now, even if immigration numbers were 1.2, 1.3, but the lived experience of the people in this country was getting better. If we could all look at each other and say, you know what, England is getting better, this wouldn't be a conversation.
Yeah, I mean, you might be right about that, but that's why I always ask for examples, and I know how annoying it can be, and in many ways you're demonstrating why some people do find it so annoying. But, there it is. The problems that the NHS face are not directly linked to immigration levels, because when immigration levels were high enough to essentially start the entire Brexit ball rolling, patient satisfaction with the NHS was the highest it has ever been. And listen, this is a bit of a trick question, Nathan, but how many of the people that looked after your wife at the hospital in Wolverhampton do you think were immigrants?
When we were there, we saw about 4 different people, and I think 2 of them were foreigners and 2 of them were British.
Okay. So that would be 50%.
Yes, yeah.
Okay. Well, I hope she was well looked after, and I hope she makes a full and speedy recovery. And I hope the 2 people who were born somewhere else who treated her aren't listening Nathan? Because what do you think they'll feel hearing you today?
Well, I mean, for further context, just
answer that. Come on, you keep complaining.
I'm actually an immigrant myself.
No, I realise that. I thought you might be, but in terms of how those healthcare workers feel to hear you saying...
Well, look, to hear me say what, though, James? I didn't say anything...
That immigration is the reason why the NHS can't provide the services that those people would like to.
And listen, it's your show. You can do whatever you want.
I have listened. I've listened a lot, Nathan.
I think the issue...
And as I say, I hope your wife has a full and speedy recovery despite having to endure the ministrations of fellow immigrants. It's 11:15.
James O'Brien on LBC.
3 minutes after 11. I think we might be quite royally screwed. I don't want you to shoot the messenger, but I don't know that Keir Starmer has achieved any of the things he hoped to achieve. Listen, this is one radio phone-in show on one radio station. Okay, it's currently the most popular in the history of commercial radio in this country, but so what? I mean, it will barely touch the sides of a population of 70 million people. But oddly, I think that the callers who, some of the callers that we've heard today prove unintentionally why he's on a hiding to nothing. Immigration could be zero, but if you go to hospital and have a bad experience, you're going to blame it on people who weren't born here. Immigration could be zero, but if someone cuts you up in traffic and flicks you the bird afterwards and they, quotes, look a bit foreign, end quotes, you're going to blame immigration. If you like to wax lyrical about British culture being under threat, and what everybody knows you mean when you say that is that there are too many people around who don't look like you or sound like you or eat like you or shop like you. And I mean, increasingly, people don't think there's anything wrong or embarrassing about holding those opinions. But what are you going to do with all the people who are making you feel uncomfortable at the moment, even if the net migration figures come down to zero? What are you going to do? Where are all the people currently making you feel uncomfortable? Where are they going to go? And that's why I worry, and this is why I use the phrase, which I don't use often, royally screwed. I worry that the more you throw into the gaping maw of nativist unhappiness, the worse everything gets, not the better. And you'd think, wouldn't you, that voting to reduce immigration in Brexit from a position of such epic ignorance that you ended up tripling it or doubling it would give people pause. But it doesn't work like that. It doesn't work like that. And I'm in such a strange position on this programme because all of my views are based on the conversations I've been having for 20 years. I don't know what Keir Starmer's views are based on. So he sees polling which talks about dissatisfaction or talks about integration or talks about British culture. I mean, traditionally a radio phone-in host comes on to a station like LBC and just says all these things and doesn't have the inconvenience of being asked for examples, of being asked to define what British culture is, or having the truth of patient satisfaction in the NHS pointed out to him. That's what radio phone-ins used to be about. That's what they were all like, is that you would just repeat the points that Sun columnists and Daily Mail columnists were making, and loads of people would ring in to agree with you, and none of them ever got asked to explain themselves. So an awful lot of my opinions and attitudes to this are completely defined by the conversations I've been having for 20 years. The best example, not on immigration, but on Brexit, was when we used to ask people what laws they were most looking forward to not having to obey. I mean, the certainty with which people would come to the conversation, claiming that Brussels was imposing laws on them that were unfair and undesirable and laws that they didn't want and that they wouldn't have to obey anymore. I remember the very first time I just said, name one. And I didn't do it from a position of debate. I did it from a position of curiosity. I started here. I was quite ambivalent on Europe. One of my best friends growing up was the son of Bill Cash. So, for goodness sake, you can't grow up with a mate like that without being exposed to Euroscepticism on an incredible level. And I was a child, so I used to think, well, the grown-ups probably know what they're talking about. So someone says, we're going to get rid of these laws. I said, in all curiosity and in all honesty and sincerity, well, which laws? Which one? Tell me what kind of law? Well, I can't name. Well, there's all of them. So you must be able to name one law that you don't like. And you don't like it to such an incredible degree that you want to leave the biggest single market in the history of humanity in order to avoid this pesky law. And then they couldn't name it. And that is why sometimes I seem to plough a lonely furrow when it comes to the immigration conversation. What is it you don't like? And the answers are pertinent, not always honest, but the answer is usually that there are too many people around who don't look like me. And I think that Keir Starmer, and judging by some of the calls I've taken today, I think Keir Starmer has made their day. And looking at my inbox and the messages from people who are dismayed by what Keir Starmer has said, despite his desperate claim that he doesn't want to denigrate anybody, and he recognises that the contribution that people have made, I think he's made the day of people. And the tragedy is that there are obviously exceptions to this. There are British towns where a white person can feel in a minority. British streets, British boroughs where a white person can feel in a minority. But how many British streets and British boroughs and British towns are there where a non-white person is going to feel in a minority? And why would one feeling so massively and completely outweigh the other, unless you don't think that they're all British people? Somewhere inside you don't think that they're all British people. And you're still not really allowed to say that, are you? Suella Braverman came close, and she, of course, had the wonderful camouflage of talking about herself. And she was using English, not British. So someone like me can't be English. It's there. That's who they're speaking to. And I think Keir Starmer might have been speaking to them today. I really do. Because here he is 5 years ago. And the other problem he's got, of course, is that people might not think he's authentic on this. So how big a journey, use that dreadful word, has Keir Starmer been on over the last 5 years?
I think Conservatives have created this hostile environment, whether it's Windrush, whether it's the general response to immigration, or whether it's just the way the Home Office make their decisions. It's based on this idea that somebody's trying to cheat rather than actually based on an open, welcoming environment. I think we should welcome people wherever they come from, thank them for their contribution, and see them as part of our families, our communities, and our society, and embrace that. I mean, London is an amazingly diverse and fantastic place for it, and the whole of the United Kingdom is better because of immigration. And I think, if I'm honest, the Labour Party's been a bit scared of making the positive case for immigration for quite a number of years. And I think we need to turn that round and broaden it out and make sure that people feel absolutely welcome here.
Aye, and we may move on to that question of whether you do feel absolutely welcome here as a consequence of a speech given this morning by that man. But first, Aisha is in Mile End. Aisha, what would you like to say?
Hello, thank you for having me.
You're very welcome.
I think it's a sad situation to be in, where people objectively forget that we are all human beings, right? So I was raised in Croydon. I'm mixed race. I have half white British family, and then I'm Gambian Mauritian. Okay, so I grew up in a very diverse area, and my favorite thing about it is I walk down the high street, right, and there's a Vietnamese greengrocer, a Turkish barber, an African shop, and then a Lidl, and then there's obviously a McDonald's, and then there's obviously a Greg's. But there's all of these.
I love the obviously in that.
But there is. But
yes, of course there is. Of course there is.
But that to me is a wonderful thing, because it shows that we can all exist next to each other. And hearing a foreign language to me is not a threat to my identity. I know what my identity is. I know where I was raised. I know the people I was around, and that to me is a wonderful thing, that all these businesses can coexist. But I think what people are misplacing their anger towards the foreigner is actually they feel as though, you had a previous caller who said he feels as though British culture and British identity is lost, right? I grew up the past 2 years, I lived with my grandma, who's a white British woman. And I used to talk to her about this stuff a lot. And she would say, I don't recognize the high street anymore. And I think what people are feeling, they're misplacing this feeling of I don't recognize it because, okay, for example, there's not my classic British butcher anymore. There's not my classic British greengrocer. There's not these small handmade boutiques of classically British things. What actually is there now are these soulless corporate businesses. There's a Greg's, there's a Costa, there's 3 Starbucks, there's a McDonald's, there's a Popeyes. There's not an opportunity for people to have independent businesses, which makes it feel like who is around you. There's not it's just soulless. These high streets have become so soulless. I went to Ireland and I was blown away. I went to Galway and all of the pubs were independent in a way. And in the pubs, all the people there were talking to each other. Even if you didn't speak the language, they were talking to you, but they were all singing these songs and everyone knew the words. And I felt like, wow, this is what the people in England feel they're missing, this community aspect that oftentimes the pub used to have for people. My dad, who was white, he used to tell me about his stories of the pub growing up, and everyone would come there and everyone, you know, if you needed a job, you'd walk in and you'd talk to someone and they'd end up giving you a job and then you'd work for them for 10 years. You know, there's this, everything's very detached now and everything's very cold and corporate and very capitalist. And I think people are blaming
That's really interesting.
The wrong thing.
There's also perhaps a yearning for their own lost youth sometimes among older people, because it's certainly not confined to older people, what you describe, but people who can actually remember the high streets you're talking about.
Yeah.
When they were walking on those high streets, they were more carefree and younger and freer almost.
I think as well, like, when you are... So I'm a young person that's grown up around people from other countries in my school. I went to a school where there was a lot of kids from all over the world speaking all these different languages. So that to me has never been an uncomfortable feeling. I think when you grow up around something, that's what you know. So to me, being around people, like if I'm on the train and no one's speaking English, I don't care. So I mean, I'll smile to you and it's nice. And if anything, like, I like talking to people that don't speak my language, because where have you come from? What a different world have you come from? How crazy is it that we're here together? I think you can't be mad that England has become this diverse when if you position yourself as the pioneer of globalization, as the pioneer of the developing world, and you, unfortunately, a lot of people don't want to admit it, but you take resources from everywhere else in the world to build that success, to build this amazing city, an amazing country that we have, with the opportunity to have takeaway every night and you can buy new clothes every day. Like this complete freedom to buy and become who you want. People are going to be drawn to that because you've taken from their country to make that.
Yes, and I mean, the reason I'm pausing is because I can't really think of how a politician addresses the feelings that you describe, except by explaining them rather than feeding them or pandering to them.
Yeah, nothing happens without context. Like, we haven't gotten to this point just one day, like all the floodgates opened and everyone came in and all of a sudden everyone's speaking Hindi on your street. That's not how it happens. There's generational things that have happened. There are generations of, like, you know, the Windrush generation got brought over, and those people, they've been here for years, decades, right? And people now are just angry because that's not in the background. They can see it now. It was always here. England is an island. People forget that. This is an island, geographically an island, and an island cannot exist without migration. If it wasn't for the French invading, we wouldn't even be here. The Germans, the royals have German blood. Like, this has always been something that will happen here, and for as long as we are separate from Europe physically, this is always going to happen. So to act like it's like this big problem now when it is a fundamental part of the fabric of being an island, what's different is the attitude. And what's different now is, unfortunately, because it's going on for so many generations, and because those immigrants have worked hard to establish themselves and own the corner shops and own businesses and own a Turkish barbers, now people can see it, and that makes them uncomfortable because when they were younger, like you said, they probably didn't see it as much, or they didn't have to pay attention to it, or they were young, so nostalgia is a big part of it. Now they can see it, and that makes them uncomfortable because, unlike me, they didn't grow up with people speaking a different language in their classroom. So to them, it makes them nervous. They don't know how to approach it.
And nobody's helping them.
Yeah, the only way to ever understand something is to talk to someone. The person that you're sitting next to on the bus who doesn't speak your language has more in common with you than you will ever know. You all struggle for the same things. You all want to feed your families. You might have both just been fired from your job. You don't know how you're going to pay rent. And you are there being angry at them speaking a different language instead of wondering, like, where they come from. Are they okay? How is their life going? Yeah, it's so mind-blowing to me that people would be so hostile.
It is genuinely mind-blowing to you. It's not to me because I've been doing this job for 20 years, but there's something incredibly refreshing about hearing how ridiculous it looks to your, obviously, rather younger eyes. How do you turn that round?
I think people need to remember that we are living in an age of where, okay, one thing I always bring up to people, which sounds ridiculous, but never forget Cambridge Analytica existed during the Brexit time. Yeah. This was a company that manipulated people in millions and thousands in order to get the Brexit vote to happen. It was so influential that the company got shut down. They were told, you have done something very wrong here. You have used social media. You have used advertising. I don't know if anyone has not seen it. Watch the documentary on Cambridge Analytica and think about how we've got to where we're at now.
Well, it's worse now than it was then. I mean, this is one area where I do know what you're talking about, but it's considerably worse now. It's gone unchecked, and of course the efforts to properly find out what happened then have been stymied by the politicians that benefited from the Brexit that the manipulation of votes delivered. One thing I will tell you, at risk of sounding patronising, God forbid, perish the thought, people hate being told they've been manipulated, and that's a big part of the problem as well.
Exactly, and I myself am just as vulnerable to being manipulated one way or another. Do you know what I mean?
Yes, of course.
And I think people more and more, like my mum is the daughter of an immigrant, and she voted Brexit. Yeah. That to me is mind-blowing, but because she's on her phone being fed all this stuff, similar to how people feel, she can't get a doctor's appointment because the other person is taking it from you.
Well, Nathan in Wolverhampton, an immigrant whose wife was treated by immigrants, convinced that the reason why the NHS is suffering is because of immigrants.
Exactly, but we must remember that there are companies that are manipulating us day by day by day.
It's not just that's the modern iteration of something that's been around for forever. I mean, I quoted quite liberally from a Daily Mail article about German Jews fleeing Hitler in the 1930s, and the language of that Daily Mail article was the sort of verbal equivalent of Farage's poster that he put up, the Breaking Point poster that he put up on the day that Joe Cox was assassinated by a white supremacist. What's mad, and what I kind of needed to hear from Aisha to be reminded of what right and wrong look like. What's mad is that those people have won everything. I mean, all right, a Labour government got in, but that was really only as a consequence of how absolutely awful everything the Tories touched was, largely as a consequence of Brexit. They got their Brexit. And now the idea is, well, we just need to do it again. We just need to do it again. We just need to come down even harder. And today, Aisha, final question, because I'm late for the news. Do you think Keir Starmer today, I don't know how much of the speech you heard, but do you think he's become part of the problem that you describe rather than the solution?
I think he is up against massive bullies against immigration, right? And ultimately, our form of government that we have, if you want to stay in power, you have to say what you think people want to hear. And I think that he believes it. I think he's going to get tougher, not because necessarily ethically he thinks it's the right thing to do or even logically, but because the other parties are so tough that it's sort of like, God, if I have any chance of actually being able to make progress with what I want to do, I'm going to have to be tougher.
I'm going to have to absorb my membership of this ecosystem.
It's adapt or die, isn't it? And he's adapting to the fact that you now have Reform who, because of social media and because of their impressive ability, this cult-like persona, charisma that they have, he has to try and compete with that. And any integrity and honest conversation about the state of this country and what migration has done will not benefit him, because it's that thing of the loudest person in the room unfortunately gets the most attention and the most bold and the most controversial.
And of course the complicity of many members of my profession, because it's so good for business to whip up the kind of hatreds that you've just done a beautiful job of diffusing. And you'd think somebody somewhere might have noticed that you can be quite successful in the British media by holding the views that Aisha holds. It's just that the opportunities seem somewhat few and far between. It is. Thank you, Aisha. You've made me 5 minutes late for the news, which is a testament to the quality of your contribution. But it's no comfort to Dominic Ellis, who is here now with the headlines.
James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 11:38, and Aisha understandably garnering an incredible amount of admiration and praise. I hope you're still listening, but It's rare, actually, to see the quantity and quality of compliment coming in for your contribution, but, I mean, in my opinion, hardly surprising. A timely moment, perhaps, to tell you that the Mayor of London, Sir Sadiq Khan, will be taking your questions on this programme tomorrow from 11 a.m. If you want to get your question in ahead of time, then head over to lbc.co.uk/question. That's lbc.co.uk/question. And if you don't, then I will most certainly be asking him questions about the conversation that is currently under discussion when you, as the son of hard-working immigrants, hear your party leader describing the dangers of becoming an island of strangers, as Keir Starmer has done this morning. You wonder two things. Who is he talking about? And crucially, who is he talking to? Who is he talking to? 11:39 is the time. Joanna is in Stirling. Joanna, what would you like to say?
Hi, James.
Hello.
Nice to speak to you again.
Likewise.
Yeah, I decided to call because I thought there were so many aspects in this story that I could identify with. One being migrant myself in Scotland,
yes,
which I think also is quite relevant. But also I'm a linguist. I work as an interpreter, so I can kind of see the migrant community, Polish migrant community from inside.
Yes.
But also, as an interpreter, I've got kind of get-togethers with other interpreters from other languages. So I know quite a lot of people across the migrant community in Scotland, and I kind of know what it looks like. But also, because I work mostly for the NHS, I've got insight from that side as well.
Gosh.
So,
well, fill your boots, Joanna.
Yeah, but my head is kind of spinning because I've been listening to the previous callers, especially Aisha. I thought she was really brilliant. But I was thinking when she was speaking about my experience, which was so different because I was brought up in Poland during communist times, which was very isolated. I didn't see people with other kind of colors of skin other than on the telly. And I didn't speak foreign languages until kind of I was a late teenager. And
wow.
I had a little bit of contact with outside world. There were people coming to Poland, but it was all very exotic. And I think I was 17 when I first went abroad, and I was to East Germany, of all places. So that wasn't...
So, wow, what a journey. What an incredible sort of late blossoming, as it were. So this conversation today, I don't know what angle you're most drawn to, but the very existence of your accent really is a testament to what integration, immigration, whatever word you want to use, sounds like. The speech that Keir Starmer has given feels to me at this point in our phone-in as if the country's gone into a reverse gear.
Maybe, but I was thinking also one thing that you were saying, what do numbers matter?
Yes.
I don't think so, because it's all about perception of numbers. So people are not really interested what the numbers are like.
I agree.
It's what they feel they're like, you know. I don't feel that much in Scotland, but because I listen to the LBC and I listen to and watch other media, I kind of know the general feelings. But funnily enough, it's not limited to Britain, because I've been speaking, for example, to people from Poland, and there are growing problems with migration in Poland, you know, because Poland, you'd think, you know, there's mostly Polish people, but nowadays there's quite a lot of migrants there, especially from Ukraine, obviously. But that the migration existed there before the war. It only increased since. But
well, this is the point Aisha was picking up on. I wonder why Scotland... I mean, I'll ask you your thoughts on that in a moment, but I see Satnam Sanghera, the Times journalist and author, posting that the thing that is turning us into an island of strangers is toxic social media and the lies being peddled, not least about migrants. And that's something with which I'd agree, and it's a point Aisha was also making. Why do you think Scotland is so much healthier than England, for example, on this specific issue?
I think Scotland quite early on realised that as a very small country that is being kind of depopulated, mostly through the aging of the society, because people, you know, there's fewer children being born that there were before. So there is kind of, you know, they realise they need a fresh influx of people from everywhere. You know,
so do we, and yet the population, as we've discovered this morning, much of the population hasn't accepted that, or refuses to accept that, or or think that we've had too much of an influx, which is a different position. It's not the same as not believing that we need anybody.
I don't know, maybe it was just the rhetoric that was, we need those people. I remember the Times, I think it was early Nicola Sturgeon that said that she welcomes migrants and she called them new Scots. And I really took that to myself. I said, somebody told me I am a Scot and I feel Scottish. I feel Polish. I feel Scottish at the same time.
That shouldn't be a controversial feeling, should it? Or a difficult thing for people to grasp.
No, and some people told me, and I've had that kind of like run-ins with some people saying, you cannot be Scottish because you were not born here.
Right.
I said, no, but I'm an adopted Scot. I came here. That was my choice. I love the country. I love the people. I really want to be here. And I'm taking part in everything that I can here in the community. And
just make sure you have good manners when you drive, Joanna. Otherwise you could get into all sorts of trouble. I don't know that anyone can answer this question, but let's try. What happens if? Because I think you're right about numbers, and this seems to me to be the epic miscalculation. What happens if they come down really, really, really far, and people are still skint, and people are still cross, and the NHS is still, because there'll be even less money to spend on it, the NHS is still creaking. What happens then? I mean, history teaches us some pretty gross lessons about what could occur when people have all their dreams come true and yet nothing changes.
Well, that's what really worries me, because I think that as long as it's just purely feelings, it doesn't matter what happens around you. You know, you'll still believe that, all your misery is due to someone coming here and you're taking those things from you. And as you said, I'm kind of being quite mindful of the undertones of the big F word, and it's just like... Yeah.
Because I don't see what satisfaction looks like. I don't see who sits back today and goes, okay, I like the sound of that. Maybe it is necessary, either for political reasons or indeed for economic or demographic reasons. But I don't know who's going to... So I keep saying, who's he talking about and who is he talking to? I'm going to give you a test, okay? Of your, because he's talking a lot about integration today, and I've referred to your accent, which I think I did last time you spoke. I probably brought Jan Molby into the conversation, but here's a test of your levels of integration. Anthony has sent me a message. Actually, I don't even know that this is British integration, saying, "I love Joanna. She gives me hope."
Okay.
I think this is probably...
In what way?
What is the cultural reference that Anthony is smuggling into that that text message? Do you know?
No.
Right, that's it. I'm going to have you deported. That's that. No, you can't. That's absolutely outrageous.
No, I should probably know, because I'm quite well integrated. I do read a lot and I watch
Eddie Grant.
Things. But...
Eddie Grant, Joanna.
All right, okay.
Have you never heard the song "Give Me Hope," Joanna?
Oh yeah, give me hope.
But that's what I just said. There we go. Eddie Grant. Eddie Grant.
It's just my slowness. I was looking for something deeper.
Well, I'll take that as a compliment and let Anthony absorb the insult. But you can stay for the time being. 11:47 is the time. Eddie Grant, actually, a very pertinent person to have cited in the context of that conversation. It is actually deeper, Joanna, if you look up a little bit about him than my sort of lazy joke aloud. It is 11:47. Up next, I've got some very, very, very sad breaking news from the Gaza Strip that speaks both to a front page in yesterday's newspaper, "For All Their Sakes, End the Deafening Silence on Gaza Now," and a comment piece in today's Times newspaper, "Why are we closing our eyes to Gaza's horror?" I'll share that with you shortly. But we're also going to have a little look about the claims by a man whose eggy breath has been felt in the background of much of this morning's discussion, that they are now actually vetting their candidates. LBC has conducted an investigation into Reform UK's claims about its vetting process, and the results will be simultaneously surprising and completely unsurprising.
James O'Brien on LBC.
It's 11:51. A couple of quick comments on the so far the most popular contributions of the morning, which have come from Aisha and And Joanna, Aisha's point about the high streets and the economy and the grievance just reminded me, and I've actually found it, an article that The Sun published the morning pretty much after the results came in back in 2016, the Brexit results. And they wrote about Boston, the town of Boston, where 75.6% voted to leave, and where it has one of the highest Eastern European populations in the UK. Two facts that are almost certainly not coincidental. But listen to how The Sun reported it. Yesterday, a buzz was back in its medieval centre, where high street stores are flanked by Polish and Lithuanian shops. And I noticed that at the time, because can you see what's wrong with that sentence? High street stores are flanked by Polish and Lithuanian shops. Crosses of St. George and Union Jack flags were adorning pubs and homes. Nothing wrong with the second bit, but what's wrong with the first bit? Yesterday, a buzz was back in its medieval centre, where high street stores are flanked by Polish and Lithuanian shops. Well, the words flanked by are redundant in that sentence. High street stores are. High street stores include Polish and Lithuanian shops. It's the language of invasion. It's the language of grievance. And that's exactly what Aisha pinpointed. And in terms of Joanna's observations about Scotland somehow being different, two thoughts. One funny, one not. Gary's is funny. Scotland doesn't need to blame its problems on immigrants, James, because we can blame England for everything, which is more fun. Brackets, this is a joke. Full stop, kind of. Close brackets. And John Swinney, the First Minister and the leader of the SNP, writes this morning, the Prime Minister's statement on immigration today will damage our economy, the NHS, social care and our universities. It ignores the need to boost Scotland's working age population. This sort of divisive language only plays into Nigel Farage's hands, not in Scotland's name. Answering the question of where you go if you're unhappy with this direction of traffic, but only in Scotland so far. Interesting. 11:53 is the time. With no further ado, we return to the F word because Joseph Draper, LBC's correspondent in the South, has been looking into, well, two things really. First of all, the claim by Reform UK that its vetting process was now up to sniff and unlikely to deliver any of the embarrassments and scandals that it has delivered with previously selected councillors and candidates. And secondly, what's actually happened. It's an exclusive report. Joseph, what have you found?
Well, James, I'll just give you an example of some of the online comments by new Reform councillors we found. Some of them range from what's been described as the outright racist, Islamophobic, misogynistic, to incredibly crass jokes and the outright bizarre. Most of them coming from here in Kent, where Reform UK now has control of the council after the local elections earlier this month. One of the worst offenders is Peter Osborne, whose joke on Facebook was about his wife locking herself in the bathroom to avoid being beaten by him after she crashed the car. And this is nestled among lots of disparaging comments about women, including one crude reference to the song Come On Eileen, although I'll spare our listeners the salacious details of that particular joke. There are also sexualised comments about Prime Minister Liz Truss and racial stereotyping, or what appears to be racial stereotyping, of then Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, with a picture of number 10 Downing Street being turned into a Londis convenience store. Another example, James, is Mary Laws. She said in the campaign that one of her priorities was to protect the environment. Now, that is technically true. She appears to be very concerned about the environment because she has shared conspiracy theories about climate change online being geoengineered, and she's accused Microsoft's founder, Bill Gates, of playing God. So clearly very concerned about the environment, but perhaps not in the way that some of her voters would expect. Now, responding to these findings, James, campaign group Hope Not Hate, they say they are consistent with what they've seen across the country. And I've been speaking to their director of research, Dr. Joe Mulhall.
Everywhere we looked and everywhere everyone else looked, we found candidates which were completely unacceptable and in some cases very extreme. So they slipped through the net somehow. So whatever vetting they did have didn't work. And in some cases, we would find stuff on now deleted Twitter accounts, etc. But a lot of it wasn't. A lot of it was front and centre. It was on their Facebook page. In some cases, it was on their Reform Facebook page. Again, this begs the question that some of these people just clearly couldn't have been vetted at all.
Now, James, we've reached out to Reform. They've not yet responded to us, but this does come after the party was forced to drop candidates at last year's general election because of concerns about their extreme backgrounds. Since then, though, the party leadership said it's fixed the vetting process, with leader Nigel Farage saying it's actually now better than the other parties and that they've turned down hundreds of potential council candidates. But looking at the content we found, campaigners are now asking, James, whether that's the whole truth.
Well, I suppose in the case of Nigel Farage, you could be forgiven for questioning whether anything he says is the whole truth. But there was quite a lot of play made out of the claim that the vetting process had been beefed up. And yet, as we've just heard, some of this stuff, and you've only really scratched the surface of it. You can read more about Joseph's investigations at lbc.co.uk. Some of this stuff was on their own social media pages.
It was easy to find, James. Most of it was publicly available, right up to the local election. Some of that content has now been hidden, but the most basic search of these candidates' backgrounds would have found it.
Do we, and this is tempting you into the realms of speculation, which you're probably far too professional to indulge, but why are so many people like this? And there's quite a lot of Tommy Robinson fan done in there as well in your investigation, as well as
Yes.
campaigning for Pegida, the German far-right group, which believes Europe has been overtaken by Islam. Why are so many people like this attracted to whatever Nigel Farage's latest political platform may be, political vehicle may be? Do we have any ideas?
Well, it's a question Hope Not Hate has been asking, and there are two possibilities. Either the vetting just isn't up to scratch, or the other possibility, and we have nothing to dispute this because the party hasn't gotten back to us, but the other possibility is, James, that some of these views are considered acceptable by the party leadership.
Well, Nigel Farage is never off this radio station at certain times of day, so I'm sure that these questions will be put to him sooner rather than later, Joseph. And of course, the fact that it's on the lbc.co.uk. Well, no, forget about the website. The website is last year's news, or at least last week's news. It's all about the app. It's all about the app. No treble. The story is available to read right now on the brand new LBC app, which you can download now. And I would not be surprised if Joseph continues investigations and continues to find evidence that either the vetting process has been completely misrepresented to the British public, or that it doesn't do any of the things that it is being claimed that it does. It's coming up to 12 noon. You are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. We could stay with the question of impact now, looking at care homes and what these measures are likely to prove, but I feel that 2 hours on this curious morning is probably enough. Why don't we have a look at a question posed by one of my favourite columnists, even though he has done things that I find deeply, impossible to approve of, written things rather. This is on the Times main column today. Why are we closing our eyes to Gaza's horror? It's a brilliant and urgent question.
James O'Brien on LBC.
It's 3 minutes after 12, and you are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Listen, this is just a chronological point, not an editorial one. But we asked this question a while ago. I don't know if you remember. Sometimes when I wade into territory that feels fresh, I get really worried. I get worried that I might be getting a bit above myself. I've been doing it a lot lately, suggesting that the rest of the media isn't necessarily giving you the facts that you need, and it's dangerous and potentially quite arrogant and foolish territory. But I think you would agree with me this morning about those numbers. It's not absent from the coverage, but it is nowhere near as prominent as it should be. The likely. Or rather, the already established reductions in immigration figures that are going to be announced by the Office of National Statistics next week are almost entirely absent or very, very late to appear, and even then with little detail in the coverage. So I don't do it lightly, but I do certainly do it trepidatiously. And rarely do I feel more trepidatious, for reasons that we may explore together this hour, than when making observations about the plight of Gazans, the plight of people in Gaza. Partly because of the personal abuse that one receives for suggesting that not every person in Gaza is guilty or deserves to be starved or brutalised, killed or maimed or injured. And partly because it is a field which I don't know as much about as perhaps I might. So I don't feel trepidatious wading into a conversation about Brexit, for example. But I do historically recognise that no one knows everything about anything, but that all of us know more about some things than we do about others. But I asked you this question a while ago. I can't remember exactly when, maybe a month ago, about why the coverage had stopped. And my theory, my suggestion was that Israel's conduct had become indefensible. A point picked up, of course, by several members of the British Board of Deputies, about 10% of whom signed a letter. And you can only wonder how many more would quite like to have done, but feared the repercussions that the 10% of the British Board of Deputies who signed a letter condemning Israel have subsequently received. And I don't think that the media knows what to do. Because for good or for ill, the British media has, I suppose with one exception, being the BBC, which has always strived to be balanced, which of course means that it will be accused of hideous bias by everybody. But the British media has always been very supportive of Israel, historically. And in the aftermath of the October the 7th terror attacks, there was nothing else to be. There may have been room for some discussion about how robust or how violent the Israeli response would be, but there was, in my view rightly, next to no discussion about whether or not a response was justified. And then we moved into that curious territory of wondering when enough would become too much. And we did this a lot together. We really did, and it was not easy at times to recognise that people were holding thoughts in their hearts that they weren't really prepared to put into their mouths. On the question of how many deaths would be too many, people would say to me, well, one is too many, and I'd say, well, there's already been 10,000. So that's not really an answer to my question. At what point would you say, please stop now, Netanyahu? At what point would you say, to quote Matthew Parris in The Times today, a former Conservative member of Parliament, of course, and one of the great columnists of our age, which doesn't mean I like or agree with everything he's ever written. He says Western allies must say enough of this savagery. Enough of this savagery. Every age looks back at previous ones aghast at things that happened on the watch of our fathers or forefathers, complicit by their silence. And he puts Israel now into that category. This is 2025, he writes. As we speak, 2 million human beings face starvation at the hands of our close ally, Israel. And that's also, of course, another reason why historically the media has been pretty clear about its loyalties. As we speak, all hell is being rained down now. Within days, new atrocities may be imminent in a promised new offensive, yet this hell on earth has all but dropped from our headlines, and we British continue to supply military kit, share intelligence, and more. And Matthew Parris asks the question, why? I don't know whether his thinking was inspired by the front page of yesterday's Independent newspaper, which pictured some, they look emaciated children and their mother on the front page, and printed the headline, "For all their sakes, end the deafening silence on Gaza now." The world has turned its gaze away from the renewed assault on Gaza and the blockade that has trapped 2 million Palestinians and condemned its children to death by malnutrition. We call upon Britain and its allies to force Israel to end a cruel war that started as a response to the Hamas atrocity of the 7th of October 2023, but has long forfeited any claim to moral justification. And this is an observation. If you fail to make that point, as I have already made, about the war starting as a response to the Hamas atrocity of the 7th of October 2023, the speed with which you are accused on social media and beyond of somehow ignoring it or not caring about it is incredible. The speed is extraordinary. And it's designed to do one thing. It's designed to undermine your contribution to the conversation. I hate the fact that tens of thousands of Palestinian people are being killed. Oh, why haven't you mentioned Hamas? Or do you? And it's not an accident. It's a tactic, and it works, and it's part of the answer to the question. Why are we closing our eyes to Gaza's horror? but I want you to answer it today. And that's part of the answer, is that speaking up about Gaza's horror involves personal sacrifice. And I don't mean anybody to get their little violins out at this point, but it is it involves painting a rather large target on your back that some quite serious members of the British media class and beyond will take aim at gleefully. And they've gone silent as well, of course, because, and this is my opinion, it's become indefensible. I don't know when it became indefensible, but I do know that we asked the right question. I do know that when we talked about a point coming where it would be too much, it would be unsustainable, indefensible is the word I'm going to keep coming back to. It is the simple question of how much is too much. So you accept, and you don't have to, but I do, the necessity of robust response, that in return for, well, it's a bit Old Testament, isn't it? But blood for blood, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. There would be a response that involves the killing of civilians to an attack that involved the killing of civilians. And the question of how we would know when a line had been crossed is one that we came back to again and again and again. How will you know? It's why we asked that question. And I think that we've passed that line without any ceremony, without any announcement. I don't know when it was. It's going to be different for different people. I don't know when it was. For me, I don't know when it was for me. But I think now the line over which people don't want to publicly defend what Israel is doing has been crossed. But that only answers half of the question. So defenders of Benjamin Netanyahu are either too thin on the ground to be counted or too ashamed of where they have found themselves. And this is what I did, and this is a bit self-aggrandizing, but I did tell you this would happen. I did tell you that people like political leaders like Benjamin Netanyahu don't betray anybody as completely as they betray their own supporters. He will turn you into a supporter of ethnic cleansing. Or, if you want to use the language of the former head of Human Rights Watch, Kenneth Roth, that he will turn you into a supporter of genocide. He will turn you into a supporter of war crimes. So on October of the 8th, 2023, loads of people queuing up, quite rightly, and I'll say that again and again and again, quite rightly to call for Israel to respond in the most bloody fashion to that hideous attack, would never have seen themselves as potential supporters of war crimes, potential defenders of war criminals, potential accessories to ethnic cleansing, potential supporters even, to quote Kenneth Roth, of genocide. And here we are. While I've been on air, the food security phase, the integrated food security phase classification, a leading international authority on the severity of hunger crises, has announced that the Gaza Strip is now at critical risk of famine if Israel doesn't lift its blockade and stop its military campaign. That's happened while we've been on air. Nearly 500,000 Palestinians are in, quotes, catastrophic, end quotes, levels of hunger, meaning they face possible starvation. Another million are at, quotes, emergency, end quotes, levels of hunger. Part of the problem, and part of the pertinence of Matthew Parris's question this morning, is that you may not know that Israel has banned any food, shelter, medicine, or other goods from entering the Palestinian territory for the past 10 weeks, even as it continues waves of airstrikes and ground operations. 2.3 million people estimated to still be in Gaza, relying almost entirely on outside aid to survive, and none of it is getting in. The capacity to produce food inside the territory has been more or less decimated by, well, that's the wrong word to use, more or less destroyed by Israel's 19-month military campaign. And the question remains, why are we closing our eyes to Gaza's horror? A little more from Matthew Parris this morning, who makes the point that I made a moment ago. It's customary at this point in a column about Gaza, to insert a carefully outraged paragraph about Hamas's unprovoked incursion into Israel on October the 7th and the slaughter and kidnapping that ensued. Take that as read, he writes, but I'm sick of whataboutery. And of course, you can't take it as read. You have to include it, otherwise the whataboutery will follow. What indeed about October the 7th? What about Sudan? What about Ukraine? People will ask. Why aren't you talking about Sudan? Why aren't you talking about Ukraine? As though further horrors can diminish a horror staring us in the face. Because here's the difference. The aggressor here is one of our allies. Israel recommends itself as a beacon of liberal democracy in the Middle East, yet a country in whose very foundation we British are profoundly implicated is doing this to the Palestinian people. This is Matthew Parris again. Hiding behind the skirts of the United States, we mumble diplomatic platitudes about the need for restraint and the rule of international law and carry on arming Israel with the greatest weapon of all, our silence. The greatest weapon of all, our silence. Why have so many people gone silent? And weirdly, we haven't. You and me are talking about it now together. So it's a question about the kind of people perhaps in the media or in politics who were very vocal about this for a very long time, or even perhaps the people who were incredibly exercised by the fact that a BBC documentary turned out to be presented by the teenage son of a Hamas civil servant. That story got oodles of coverage. The fact that 500,000 Palestinians are now in catastrophic levels of hunger will get a tiny fraction. Why? Why are we closing our eyes to Gaza's horror? Some of the answers may be prosaic, that there may be a fatigue. As with all wars, we don't talk about Ukraine as much as we used to talk about Ukraine. You reach a state of status quo almost, don't you? And nothing new has happened. But I don't think that's true here. I think the escalation over the last 10 weeks has been truly hideous. And most people in this country will know nothing about it. And this is, I think, the heart of Matthew Parris's puzzle this morning. It was widely and deeply reported for months. The horror of the original terror attack prompted levels of journalism, reportage, claim, many of which, of course, subsequently turned out not to be true, that were absolutely off the charts. So that the idea that it was not relevant or important enough is demonstrably false. Something has changed. Something about the British media and the British government's relationship with Israel's actions in Gaza has changed beyond all recognition. And I want you to tell me why. Why are politicians not objecting more loudly? Why are arms still being sold? And why are the people who profess to be outraged by the antics of an Irish rap group called Kneecap on music festival stages saying nothing to you about what Benjamin Netanyahu is doing to millions of Palestinian people, i.e., according to a leading international authority on hunger crises, starving them? Critical risk of famine if the blockade isn't lifted, a 10-week-old blockade. Why are we closing our eyes to Gaza's horror? That's it. That's the question. 0345 6060 973. And, of course, by definition, you're not, because you've just heard me. And if you've turned me off halfway through this introduction, then you are closing your eyes to Gaza's horror, but you're not going to be able to tell me why, because you're not listening to the programme anymore. So we will speculate. Analyse, think out loud about what Matthew Parris is describing here. It is quite extraordinary what we're witnessing. You will know from Louis Theroux's recent documentary, if you've seen it, what happens when settlers move into territories that Israel covets. Matthew Parris goes somewhere that I can't remember a mainstream British commentator going this morning. It's imaginable that nothing will halt the pursuit of a greater Israel, annexing after Gaza the West Bank, where a stealthy but relentless consolidation of settler land grabs proceeds with tacit government acquiescence. To many in the Israeli coalition, this has always been the bigger picture, and Gaza only a sideshow. He describes the moral stain seeping almost imperceptibly through civil and military policy until one day Israelis may wake up to find themselves counted alongside a dozen other nasty Middle Eastern countries, like their neighbours, just another vaguely unsavoury regime. Why are we closing our eyes to Gaza's horror? And my early answer to that question is because so many people in positions of prominence in British politics and British media and public discourse were so completely supportive of everything that Benjamin Netanyahu did, they're too ashamed to come out and say they were wrong. Either that or they approve of the ethnic cleansing. They approve of what Kenneth Roth describes as genocide. They approve of what the Integrated Food Security Phase Classification describes as an imminent famine. Either they approve of it or they're too ashamed to admit that they were wrong. Or insert your own answer to this question. 0345 6060 973 is the number you need. Matthew Parris asks in the Times this morning, why are we closing our eyes to Gaza's horror? What is your answer?
James O'Brien on LBC.
23 minutes after 12. Of course, part of the answer may be the fact that people like Suella Braverman claimed that if you wanted to show support for the Palestinian people, you somehow became a de facto supporter of Hamas terrorists. A disgusting slur that went largely unchallenged by the kind of people who were persuaded, certainly in the final weeks of October of 2023, that Benjamin Netanyahu was justified to throw whatever he wanted to throw at Gaza. But no one seems to think that now. So where have they all gone? And why are we closing our eyes to Gaza's horror as a country, as a population, as a government? Rachel is in Wandsworth. Rachel, what would you like to say?
Hi, James.
Hello.
I've listened to you for a long time, and this is a subject I feel quite passionately about. As someone that's followed this very closely from the beginning, I find it hard to imagine not caring.
Yes.
And not having that constant niggling in the back of your mind, just with everyday things that, people right now are losing their children, are losing their families. From the beginning, there were a lot of people who couldn't believe or wouldn't believe or didn't want to believe that Israel would do the things they're doing now. And I think it's become a slippery slope. I had friends at the outset when I was posting things, and they were actually Jewish friends in New York, who said, you don't really think that Israel would bomb a hospital, do you?
Right.
And we had a nice back and forth. My outreach to them was, I hope you're okay. I'm posting stuff, I hope you're okay. I know it's hard at the moment. You don't really think that they would do. You don't really believe that. And I don't know where you go in those people and those voices. Where do you go from that? How do you now say, well, actually, you know what? The things that we said would never be done by Israel are being routinely carried out. I don't think it's a conversation people want to have. Yeah. I don't know if you start in that mindset, where you go from there. How do you... everything becomes the new normal. Day by day, we're going on a slippery slope of what becomes acceptable, what becomes part of the news cycle. Just like with Trump, that nothing can surprise us now. It just becomes noise.
But we can't stop covering Trump.
No, we can't. Well, because we're not funding Trump.
But he's an ally. He's an ally. So there you're talking about politicians. What about all the people who do what I do for a living, who get their knickers in almighty twists about rappers saying stupid things from the stages of music festivals, but say nothing about 500,000 Palestinians facing starvation?
I mean, I do think there's a lot to be said for follow the money and to who's being funded by whom and who's being told that what they're allowed to say online. Thankfully, we have people like you that are saying what they think. But I think a lot of people
Matthew
don't
Parris
want
in the
to
Times, which is owned by Rupert Murdoch. So, there may well be engines of influence at play, but that applies to any story that we talk about. People are always going to be trying to influence media coverage, whether it's a gob on a stick on the radio.
It just feels like so much more of a cover-up with Israel that you can't say things. People were worried about their jobs.
But you can. I mean, listen, anyone who does what I can do for a living, can say what I've said today. Anyone can. Anyone who was writing articles about the kid whose dad turned out to be a Hamas civil servant presenting a BBC documentary, anyone writing articles about that can say what I'm saying now. Anybody outraged by the Kneecap's comments on a festival stage, they can all say what I'm saying now. I don't think we need to go further than your original analysis into the realms of control and censorship. The original analysis is that these people, in good faith, supported Benjamin Netanyahu's response to that hideous terror attack, and can't go back on that support for reasons that you and I don't really understand. Why can't you say, I was supportive of the original response, but they crossed a Rubicon? I can't pinpoint precisely when it was crossed, but this is disgusting. And Israel's Western allies, again to quote Matthew Parris, must say enough of this savagery. Why can't they say that?
I have to say I'd much rather think that they are ashamed or that they are being somehow censored than actually try and face the idea that they don't have any humanity.
So those are the three options. They're not allowed to say it, which I can tell you isn't true. They don't want to say it because the personal shame attached to it is such, and we are all humans, defined in many ways by guilt and shame. Or option three, they're comfortable with the savagery. They like the savagery, or they think the savagery is necessary.
I don't understand how anyone can align themselves with the ideology that starving babies, starving families is any way justifiable under any circumstances. But I also wonder how much, and I'm not speaking to the people that are educated and journalists, but how much of the general population is seeing what I see. How much are they, my algorithm is Gaza. I'm seeing a lot of this content.
Yes.
But I wonder how other people, I'm clicking on it because I don't want to become complacent. I want to still be horrified because I need to be horrified because it's still happening.
And
but other people won't.
No, and I guess sympathy for not wanting that trauma in your life, in your feed as well, as I'm sure you do, because you know, whether you're seeking it out or whether it's seeking you out, it can be profoundly upsetting. But Matthew Parris speaks directly to that point when he says every age looks back at previous ones, aghast at things that happened on the watch of our fathers or forefathers, complicit by their silence. How is this going to look? How are our successors going to feel when one day British children are taught at school that in their own century, their own countrymen averted their eyes while Palestinians faced a rain of missiles and bombs, with many tens of thousands dying in the assaults? That these wretched people were herded, desperate and confused, into one corner then another. That they were starved of food and medical aid, while powerful elements in an Israeli coalition cabinet hinted in thinly veiled comments about relocation and ethnic cleansing, and the president of our greatest ally made swaggering remarks about turning the whole of Gaza into some kind of beach-adjacent real estate. That's such a powerful device that Matthew Parris employs. Imagining what it will look like to historians of the future, but crucially, of course, also to pupils of history in the future. How the heck will this look? And all the whataboutery, and all the attendant claims, all the dead cats and distractions, they won't make the history books, except by way of explanation of the savagery, or rather explanation of the complicity. The silence is complicity. It's coming out to 12:30. Tim Humphrey is here now with your headlines.
James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 12:32. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. And the question is hideous, actually. Why are we closing our eyes to Gaza's horror? You heard me read the bit by Matthew Parris about why you have to mention the Hamas terror attack of October the 7th, and that if you forget to do so in any context during these conversations, you will be jumped upon. He puts it really well. It's customary at this point in a column about Gaza to insert a carefully outraged paragraph about Hamas's unprovoked incursion into Israel on October the 7th. Take that as read, he writes, but I'm sick of whataboutery, and you've heard me mention it at least 5 times. Jane has been listening to the same programme, and she's texted to say, or she's WhatsApped to say, you forgot about October the 7th, James. I am disappointed, but I am not surprised. So even when you do it, they're queuing up to tell you that you're somehow morally questionable, or that you're at fault, or that you're wrong, and of course also that you're anti-Semitic, although I don't think I've got any of those in my inbox at the moment, which may or may not be significant. I'm anti-starvation, I'm anti-famine, I'm anti-ethnic cleansing, I'm anti what Kenneth Roth describes as genocide. Oh yeah, that means you're anti-Semitic. And that may be part of the reason why elements of the conversation have been closed down, but why do the people who in many ways started the conversation and kept the conversation going, why have they gone silent? Why are they closing their eyes to Gaza's horror? Gillian's in Chorleywood. Gillian, what would you like to say?
Good afternoon, James.
Hello,
your callers have been brilliant, as have you. I think this anti-Semitic thing is the thing that terrifies me the most. We're all frightened of being called anti-Semitic. I've got very good friends and neighbours that I've known with my kids going to school for 50 years. And whenever I speak to them on the phone, I have this dread that it's a criticism of them.
Yes.
And it isn't. I think we all have to separate Jews from Israelis if that's a possibility.
Or even the Israeli government and its supporters from everybody else. From everybody else.
Yes, absolutely. And the settlers, it's just the most terrifying thing and if you do say anything, up comes the Holocaust. And this is becoming, I don't know, it is the most horrendous thing to starve people en masse, to prevent everyone, whether it's woman, man, child, from having food, medicine, water, and reducing their homes and their country to rubble. And then that idiot chump is just beyond words. I just don't have enough words to describe it.
You mentioned the Holocaust, and it's not often that I rely so heavily upon someone else's work, but I just found Matthew Parris's piece this morning so powerful. He points out that the Holocaust is, as it always should be, on the conscience of the Western world, and guilt is a driving force for the sympathies and admiration that the free world has felt for Israel's battle to survive and prosper. And of course, as he writes, the corollary of guilt has always been innocence. And so Israel were always the good guys, weren't they?
Yes.
Until they weren't.
Absolutely. Yes, you've got it. That's it. Yes. We're frightened of criticising. For that very reason,
and you speak as someone that wants to, so it's a funny one, isn't it? Because I want to. I've got a huge platform compared to most people, and yet I have to gird my loins a bit when I wade into this territory, which means that there has been a successful campaign of intimidation.
Yes, but what do we do? What do we, the general public? You have such a huge audience, we all. What do we do?
You need to hit the politicians with the question, I suppose, when you see them, and you need to hit them hard. But of course, the access to the politicians are normally there to pursue a completely different conversation. They're there to announce the latest policy pronouncement. I'm thinking of government policy. Any popping up this week will be there to talk about the immigration white paper. But if you are speaking to Yvette Cooper, or you are speaking to Keir Starmer, or you are speaking to David Lammy, I don't know that anyone would blame you for just paying lip service to whatever the issue at the moment might be, and then hitting them repeatedly with these words from Matthew Parris, and from many, many others, of course, which is the historical context of complicity in atrocities, which is where we are now as an ally. And that perhaps explains. There's two elements to the conversation, and Gillian's expertly highlighted the one I'd overlooked, which is me, people like us. Why have we gone quiet? And I guess that answer is just as troubling as the answer to the question of why the people who were very full-throated in their support of Netanyahu have had almost nothing to say about the most recent events. Thank you, Gillian. Susie's in Haringey. Susie, what would you like to say?
I'm very aligned with the previous callers. I think the idea of not wanting to take on the guilt of being complicit in it because people have remained silent is an important point. And I think Gabor Mate, who is he's a Holocaust survivor, his family, he's got really, really important things to say. He's Jewish, and he is a Canadian Jewish psychotherapist, therapist, philosopher, and he brings out a lot of the points that you've made. There is something about people's inability to take responsibility, maybe, for the fact that they were wrong. That the idea that it's quite psychologically challenging to change your mind. I mean, you get this with Brexit. Yeah. So people actually being able to say, I got it wrong. Education is actually about not knowing something and then knowing something, but for some reason that kind of escapes people's sort of ability to process that idea that now you know something, it's okay to think differently.
But you don't even have to. To shout stop, or to just say enough of this savagery is it doesn't demand that you then say, you were wrong originally or you became wrong at some point. You just say, at this point now, my view is that this should stop, and I will be taking no further questions.
Yeah.
You see what I mean?
I think, no, definitely. I mean, and I think the thing that I've been out quite a lot of times on the streets with a lot of other people, and there's been some really very, very peaceful marches in London. At first, it was like, oh, well, these are hate marches. No, I mean, people were putting signs like, I'm here out of love, not hate.
Yeah.
And it's love of the people that have been so horribly treated since 1948. It really, I think...
But it didn't stop people like Suella Braverman and others with newspaper columns and broadcast platforms from describing everybody on those marches as a Hamas supporter or an anti-Semite.
Well, indeed that. And, you know, the fact that, I mean, I don't know how much, if you've been on any of those, but every time a group of Orthodox Jews from Stamford Hill are there saying, we do not align with Israel, and they are. You know, this is, and there's a huge Jewish bloc there every time. It's like the idea that you are conflating anti-Semitism with not being in favour of Zionism and indeed genocide is just. A lot of the mainstream papers are not doing that, and that is deeply frustrating because we know that people like Murdoch, etc., the likes of some of the mainstream media are deeply embedded in...
Well, it's in Murdoch's newspaper today.
Israel.
It's in Murdoch's newspaper today that Matthew Parris makes many of the points you are making. And again, possibly as a consequence of my own experiences, just to clarify that when Susie uses the word Zionism, she means a support for everything that the Israeli administration does. She doesn't mean... simple support for the right of the modern state of Israel. Well, I should check that that's what you mean, Susie. You don't question the right of the modern state of Israel to exist.
I do not support what settlers are doing by kicking people out. I mean, there was an amazing film I saw recently. No, there was another one. The guy they won the Oscar for the documentary. Yes. There was an Israeli and a Palestinian.
Yeah, we spoke to producers. One of them on the program.
It was No Other Land, I think it was called.
Yes,
and
it was called.
Yeah, and that was extraordinary testament to how. And I mean, there's a whole load of. I mean, there's a lot of psychological stuff. You wonder about. I mean, it sounds weird, but it's like envy because Palestinians, when you see them, they're a very joyful people that have inhabited that land, and they have beautiful art and poetry, and it's almost like that is being taken away from them as well. You know, that has already been taken away from them, and their freedom and their right to move, their right to even, and now their right to exist. It feels like it's a kind of gradual taking away of everything.
And
that's just. What makes me want to cry.
No, I hear you, and of course it does. And this isn't necessarily the top priority in the short term, but in the long term it will be because it renders. Support or render silence in Israel complicity as well. So it's not just the allies, it's not just Western allies who Matthew Parris is talking to today, but it is a question of hemorrhaging historical support or historical sympathy. In fact, he uses that word. Victimhood has been a formidable weapon in the Israeli armory. That's not a criticism, that's an acknowledgement of the role that the Holocaust plays in the collective consciousness, the Six-Day War, when Israelis turned the tables on their Arab aggressors, and the West's remorse, history's shame. But that could be hemorrhaged in the current conflict as well. It's imaginable, he writes, even likely that Israel will emerge a bigger and more powerful country than before. Thank you, Susie. 12:42 is the time. Speaking of that film, I just wanted to double-check my facts. I'm sure Susie knows this. But the Palestinian director of that film was recently detained by Israeli settlers himself. One of the co-directors of a documentary with Israeli colleagues was attacked by Israeli settlers before being detained by the Israeli military. We covered it at the time, as indeed the fact that he was later released. And there's another film in the offing at the moment that the BBC is not broadcasting, because of the brouhaha that blew up when the last documentary was broadcast and turned out to involve the teenage son of a civil servant in the Hamas-run Gaza Strip, and therefore inevitably a Hamas official himself by consequence of his job. And the Louis Theroux documentary has made broadcast, but one made by an outfit called Basement Films has currently not, and the makers of that film are quite, well, I'd say baffled or upset or both by the continuing failure of the corporation to broadcast that film. But even if you get your film made, even if you get your film shown, even if you win a flipping Oscar for it, you could still get detained by settlers and attacked by Israeli settlers and detained by the Israeli military. It is 1:45, and I mention all of that because it might be part of the answer to the question that we're asking. If an Oscar-winning film director who worked in conjunction with Israeli colleagues and collaborators can end up in physical peril from Israeli settlers and incarcerated by the Israeli military, even someone who has succeeded on that stage as a beacon for collaboration can end up being punished so brutally, what chance ordinary mortals or lesser people who decide to stick their head above this particular parapet? Thank you, Susie. It is coming up to 1:45. You are listening to James O'Brien on LBC.
James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 12:47 and you are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. A couple of texts before we get back to the phones. The first one is from David in Brackley. As a Jew, dual national British-Israeli, I am ashamed. My stomach is in knots and my heart is breaking. I am ashamed that the current Israeli government is continuing its barbaric, inhumane and appalling actions in Gaza. Jews and Israelis can no longer play the victim card. Netanyahu and his henchmen have gone beyond the pale. Alan says, if you're more ashamed of being wrong than you are of standing by while 2 million people are starved to death, you are a sorry excuse for a person. And this from Dan, who picks up on something I shared with you earlier. Your recent text from Jane accusing you of forgetting to mention October the 7th, just a little aside from me, after I'd mentioned it 5 times, is just a manifestation of a belief among many within the Jewish community of the UK that only Jewish lives matter and that the crisis in Gaza only began on October the 7th. As a British Jew, I have encountered a stunning degree of denialism and ignorance within many in the UK Jewish community regarding the true relationship between the State of Israel and Palestinian history, to such an extent that I don't think it's unreasonable to directly ask many within the community why they have lost the capacity to understand that there are two sides to every argument. My fear is that by asking the question, we will discover that many within the UK Jewish community actually don't see the other side as valid at all and simply don't see an argument. They are living with a fantasy of Israel as it may once have existed in their imagination 30, 40 or 50 years ago and seem unable to recognize the Israeli state and its government for the way it behaves now, with tragic consequences. Louise is in Acton. Louise, what would you like to say?
Hiya. So I actually nearly called in last week because you're talking about the Sycamore Gap story. And it's kind of, but I think in some ways this story, I think it illustrates the same thing by doing the opposite. The reason people engage with that story is there's a very simple, a bad thing happened. You found the bad guys, they got locked up. And so people can kind of invest their energy into a single bad event that was mostly symbolic. We can't do anything about it. It's done. Completely done, and none of us have any obligation to do anything about any of it, and it's very straightforward to think about. The whole thing is complicated the whole way through. It's a level of suffering that none of us can really contemplate, or numbers we cannot think about, and there is no clear ending, so our brains can't or don't want to engage with the narrative of it.
That's very generous to people who were talking about it all the time before Israel's position became indefensible.
Oh, yeah, I think that's true, but I think because there's nothing we can do about it.
But there never was. There never was. So you don't explain why all of the people who had lots and lots and lots to say and were queuing up to condemn anybody who didn't agree with them in the most unpleasant of terms, they've gone silent now.
Maybe because suffering's gotten so much worse that we just still can't engage or think about it. The brain moves on, time passes. Same with the war in Ukraine. That's still as bad as it ever was. But we can't stop thinking about that as well. That's what you're probably challenging me in a very positive way. You're completely right. I'm sure I've missed something here. But I think that it's something we just don't want to keep things. We don't want to keep thinking
you only
about
need
it.
To speak for yourself to be right. You only need to explain why you think you're not.
I think but when no ending comes in sight, so we want the satisfaction of some kind of ending, and we want to believe there will be some kind of ending, and there still isn't one in sight. It gets more and more complicated. Then Iran starts piling in, everything that's going on around the whole of the Middle East gets more complicated. Trump comes along, makes it more complicated.
Yeah.
And we just want to, it stops being this kind of like clarity of we can just keep condemning it.
But again, just saying it, enough of this savagery is not necessarily a contribution or an intervention that needs anything else. That's why I find Paris's piece so powerful today. It's a shame it's behind a paywall, otherwise I'd share it with you. But we have reached the point at which Israel's Western allies must say enough of this savagery. In the specifics of the current moment, I mean, you're right. Obviously, you're right. Everybody listening knows you're right. Historically, every caller would acknowledge the historical context and the incredibly complicated histories involved here. From whatever side of the argument you wanted to come, that's probably the one area on which everybody would agree. Well, not quite, because of course if you think there's a biblical justification for everything that you do, then you don't acknowledge the existence of complication or the existence of contradiction. But everybody else acknowledges that. And you don't need to go further. You just need to say, stop this savagery now. Stop this starvation tactic. Stop this now. And then we'll deal with the future when we get there. But yes, I mean, you're also right. I'm certain of it, that there is an element of trauma fatigue kicking in. But if it's kicking in for us, what the hell is it like for them in Gaza itself? Beth is in Hammersmith. Beth, what would you like to say?
James, thank you for having me on. It's double standards. It's the double standards that existed in the 1940s when it was known that the Jews were being slaughtered, among other people across Europe.
Yes.
And I want to draw your attention to a piece written by Simon Cooper 2 weeks ago on the 5th of May in the Financial Times.
Yes.
80 years on, only the traumas endure. And he makes the point, wars are heritable. And he talks about, the depression that survives in Rwanda after the 94 genocide. And he says, future generations of Palestinians, Ukrainians, Russians, and Sudanese will inherit traumas. And Israeli killings of Palestinians are in part, surely, an expression of Israel's collective war trauma. The perpetrators believe their violence can prevent another Holocaust of Jews. That's a direct quote from Simon Cooper. It's in the...
I'm a big fan of Simon's. That's Kuper for people who want to look it up. Writing in the FT. That doesn't... I mean, I think he's right, but it doesn't necessarily... Well, it doesn't address the question that Matthew Paris is asking today, which is about the silence and borderline complicity.
But, James, the point is he's writing on the anniversary. He's not being silent. He's a Jew himself.
Yes.
And he's writing about the horror he's clearly experiencing.
Yes.
And, Israel has always asked for a special treatment. And the same goes for Rwanda, for Sudan, for Southeast Asia, where these enormous genocides have occurred.
And it brings us back to Gabor Mate, actually, who a previous caller cited, because he's written at great length about inherited trauma, and in his case, inherited from his own mother. And so therapists are fond of saying quite rightly that the body keeps the score, but you introduce, and Simon Cooper introduces another dimension, which is that it's a generational exercise in scorekeeping, isn't it?
It is, and we are still being bystanders the way 2 generations ago Americans and Western Europeans and Russians, to an extent, were bystanders.
Gosh, that's a bleak analysis.
It is, I'm sorry to say.
Well, thank you for your contribution. I will think about that after the show today. It's coming up to 12:56. I've got time, I think, for one more call. Thank you, Beth. And it's going to be Sarah, who's in Fleet. Sarah, what would you like to say?
Yeah, I mean, I have been writing to my MP on this matter, and I have actually written to Keir Starmer. I think the thing that I find quite astounding is the hypocrisy. So we hear Keir Starmer talking about the war in Ukraine, which is appalling, but he will criticise Putin if he bombs civilian areas or if a hospital is targeted, etc. And yet we've seen the wholesale destruction of Gaza, and he doesn't speak out. And I think it's really traumatising for a lot of people to actually watch the images that we see on Channel 4 in particular news. and I just can't understand why it's continuing. It's, we've just celebrated VE Day, the European Convention of Human Rights, and everything that Winston Churchill and the British government did to ensure that things like this never happens again. We're celebrating whilst people are losing their lives in Gaza. It's appalling.
And the silence is baffling, perhaps, even, especially when you think about how outspoken people like David Lammy have been in the past about scenarios that were hideous, but not as hideous as this one.
Yeah, I wonder if it's to do with Trump not wanting to upset the Americans. It seems like Keir Starmer doesn't want to do anything that Donald Trump may disagree with. I would suggest from what I've seen that perhaps David Lammy, when he has spoken out, has been kind of told to rein it in. I just think that there's a conspiracy of silence, which, as you said, historically this will come back to bite us on the bottom.
That's a very delicate turn of phrase at the end of your far from delicate contribution, Sarah. Thank you. And it is largely driven by Matthew Parris's article in the Times today, although I'm mentioning that out of admiration and professional courtesy, not because I'm trying to put him in the firing line for any criticism or abuse that follows, because I agree with pretty much every single syllable that he has written, and it's a deeply thoughtful piece that echoes entirely the front page of yesterday's Independent newspaper, which would be perceived as sitting somewhere rather different on the scale of political influence, or rather political background. Paris writing in a paper owned by Rupert Murdoch. For all their sakes, is the front page of the Independent. End the deafening silence on Gaza now. And I'm not sure that we're much clearer on what drives that silence, but we're clearer perhaps than we were at 12 noon. Thank you. Never easy. In fact, it's so never easy, I'm going to allow myself one text. This from James. James, you handle the subject of Gaza, Palestinians and Israel masterfully. To be so well informed, stay so calm in the face of such horror and such fury, and to treat the subject with, dare I say, wisdom must take its toll. It does, mate, but it's nothing compared to what people in the actual story experience, is it? Or people more heavily invested in covering it. If you missed any of today's show, you can listen back on Catch Up on both Global Player and the brand new LBC app, where you can stay up to date with all the latest news and opinion, put your news categories in the order that you want, pause and rewind live radio, and listen to a range of podcasts. Download the all-new LBC app for free from your app store now. Tom Swarbrick will be with you at 4, but now it's time for Sheila Fogarty.
James O'Brien on LBC.